Okay, while we're waiting on the ranking member to get here, I've provided a book for all the subcommittee members. We have grid security under our jurisdiction now. We're going to have a hearing at some point on the grid. This is a great book by an author from North Carolina. It deals with an EMP, but it really shows a lot of interesting facts about what happens when you lose electricity. And it's a great read, too. So anyway, that's a gift from me. If you could take a chance to read it, it's an excellent, excellent book. We'll get started as soon as Diana gets here. All right, the Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security will now come to order. We're going to address today the American nuclear energy expansion, powering a clean and secure future. Chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank all of you for being here. I call this hearing to set the table for what I hope will be bipartisan, durable policymaking this Congress to expand American nuclear energy and its many benefits for the nation. I think we're off to a good start. Just last week, Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Subcommittee Ranking Member Dingell, and I wrote a number of key nuclear associations and stakeholders to assist our efforts. We asked for comments and recommendations for what may be needed to update nuclear licensing and regulatory activities to provide for a robust and growing industry. The stakeholder information we seek will inform our work to deploy more nuclear energy. Just yesterday, several of my colleagues on this committee and I returned from a trip to Europe. We met with several groups excited about the promise of deploying more nuclear, especially advanced reactors like SMRs. And I believe the chairwoman will probably talk a little bit more about that. While many European countries are expanding nuclear power, Germany is actively shutting it down. Just on Sunday, stopping and closing 3 nuclear reactors. We cannot let this be the reality in the United States. Nuclear energy must be a part of our energy matrix. To expand the industry, it's vital we encourage regulatory certainty and make sure our reactor licensing processes enable the safe and broad deployment of nuclear technologies. This is especially important for advanced reactor technologies. The Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission play important roles to advance a new era of nuclear innovation. DOE and its national labs provide critical support to developing, demonstrating, and promoting advanced nuclear. The NRC, of course, is important to assuring the public of adequate protection of health and safety of our nuclear operations. I'm from South Carolina. My state's a leader in nuclear energy. Nuclear power is responsible for 54 to 58% of our electricity in the state and over 90% of our carbon-free electricity. We also are home to the Savannah River site, a DOE nuclear security enterprise site which supports our nation's nuclear weapons and environmental management missions. South Carolina also witnessed the failure of VC Summer. This project has created perceived risk of uncontrolled cost overrun and project abandonment, which has limited commitment to new reactor development in this country. We cannot let this concern inhibit nuclear deployment. Nuclear energy is by far our nation's leading source of carbon-free electricity. It's also among the most reliable sources of power, with a capacity factor surpassing 90% more than any other generating source. Being a leader in nuclear technology provides the United States significant geopolitical advantage and leverage. A robust nuclear energy export market gives America credibility to set global nuclear norms, the guidelines that ensure safe nuclear energy generation and exports. Despite this, growth in the U.S. nuclear industry has stagnated over the past decade. China and Russia are seizing this opportunity and doubling down on their nuclear investments. We cannot cede our global leadership to adversaries. We must prioritize modernizing our regulatory structure in the United States and do what is needed to encourage growth throughout the industry. We also look at what is standing in the way of demonstrating and deploying advanced reactors. Our engineers are developing new reactor designs that promise less expensive, more efficient, widely deployable, and walk-away safe technology. We must modernize our licensing structure and establish an advanced fuel supply to bring these technologies online. The U.S. nuclear fleet is operating at the highest levels of performance and safety in history. If you visit a nuclear plant, you'll see the commitment to their safety and their procedures. Let's talk about that experience today and how it should inform our policies. Our witnesses today provide testimony from different perches in the stakeholder community, from a leading DOE national laboratory to utilities and industry to policy think tanks. They can help guide us through some of the promises and challenges to expanding nuclear energy here in the United States. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Fulcher from Idaho to introduce one of our panelists.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Jess Gehin today, Associate Laboratory Director at the Idaho National Lab, the nation's nuclear laboratory in Idaho, the Gem State. Dr. Gehin is responsible for research, development, and demonstration of advanced reactors at INL through such programs as the National Reactor Innovation Center. He has 30 years of experience in our national laboratory system with a career focused on nuclear energy. Dr. Gehin has served as the National Technical Director for the Department of Energy's microreactor program. Currently, he's working on INL's small modular reactors that range from 20 to 300 megawatts of power. Dr. Gehin has advanced degrees in nuclear energy, including a doctorate degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was an associate professor at University of Tennessee, as a fellow of the American Nuclear Society. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I welcome Dr. Gehin and thank you. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his introduction. I'm excited about today's hearing. We're going to delve into it, jump in with all fours, and with that, I'll recognize the ranking member to get for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. As we look to transition our nation to zero carbon emitting forms of energy to stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis, it's important to know the role that nuclear energy can play in that fight. Nuclear energy is responsible for generating nearly 20% of all of our nation's electricity. And it's now responsible for almost half of the carbon-free electricity that we create here in the United States. So we know that to combat the climate crisis, we must reduce our emissions. And the only way to do that is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels while electrifying every part of our lives. If done with rigorous science-based regulations, nuclear energy can help us manage that load. It has the ability to help us move towards a zero-carbon energy future without sacrificing Americans' access to the electricity that they need. Because here's the thing, if we're going to reach our climate goals, we're going to need a diverse mix of energy sources, and nuclear can be one of those sources. However, that's not to say that nuclear energy is the single perfect solution to our country's energy needs. In fact, if nuclear energy is to play a role in our energy transition, we must address two things. First, the United States must develop a comprehensive science-based strategy to dispose of spent fuel, a strategy that does not cause harm to public health or our environment. If we don't have a long-term permanent solution for disposing of nuclear waste, then we will struggle to be able to use this source of carbon-free electricity. We must also figure out how to handle the aging of our nuclear plants. Since I've been in Congress, we've only had one new nuclear power plant come online. And during that same time, we've shut down and decommissioned many reactors across the country, including the one reactor we had in my state of Colorado. Because of advancements in technology that have been made over the years, the U.S. nuclear industry has been able to maintain its non-carbon emitting electricity generation capability for more than 3 decades now. But with several more nuclear plants scheduled to close in the coming years, and as the impacts of the climate crisis become more apparent, we have to find ways to avoid any reductions in the non-carbon emitting portfolio of our energy sector. As the chairman said, he and I and the chairs of the full committee sent a series of letters yesterday to key stakeholders in the nuclear energy industry asking for their input and recommendations on how we can improve the licensing process without sacrificing the health and safety of our constituents. So as we continue to invest in and expand our use of nuclear energy in this country, it must be done in a way that continues to protect the health and the safety of the American people. I'm sure all of the witnesses here today will agree with that foundational statement. We need rigorous, science-based regulations, and we need strict oversight. So I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about potential improvements to the application and licensing process. I also believe, however, it's important that we hear from the body overseeing this work, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that as a follow-up to this hearing, we should have another hearing with commissioners from the NRC to discuss, from their point of view, where we can make improvements without sacrificing public health and safety. Thank you for having this hearing. I think this is a great bipartisan step towards our energy policy, and I yield back.
And we plan on having that hearing with NRC coming up this summer. It's now my honor to recognize the chair of the full committee on energy and commerce, Ms. McMurray Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. American leadership in nuclear energy and nuclear technology is critical to our economic security and our national security. It must be part of a strong energy mix. It's how we win the future with clean, reliable, and affordable energy to power our way of life, keep the lights on, build stronger communities, and keep our economies going. Many of us just returned from Europe, where we heard a lot about the scary realities of shutting down nuclear energy. Putin is weaponizing Europe's reliance on Russian natural gas. As he shuts down gas pipelines, countries have been forced to scramble to secure their energy supplies, keep their economies running, and energy affordable. Germany, which just completed its phase-out of its nuclear power plants this weekend, is especially in crisis. Since Putin began cutting supplies, electricity prices have skyrocketed. The government has asked citizens to ration energy. And as reported by NPR, Germany is even stocking up on candles to prepare for blackouts. Without reliable sources of energy like nuclear, Germany's security is weakened and is returning to the dark ages. Just yesterday morning, when we were in Warsaw, we participated in a signing ceremony for an agreement between the United States and Poland in conjunction with GE Hitachi's small modular reactor deployment. It was inspiring to see all the excitement in Poland for this nuclear deal, and another one for the 3 large nuclear reactors and potentially 3 more. Poland's leaders, like so many of us in Congress, understand and appreciate the reliable and secure energy that comes from nuclear. They are looking at other American nuclear technologies like NuScale's Voyager reactors. Not only is this an indication of a strong U.S.-Poland relationship, it shows that nuclear energy must be a key part of our future. America, not Russia or China, must lead to restore and expand our leadership in nuclear energy. And we do it by unleashing our unmatched genius for innovation, by assuring a predictable regulatory landscape to help attract investment and support decisions to expand nuclear deployment, and by encouraging new technologies that will provide exciting new nuclear applications, such as providing power and heat for industrial uses. Our central question today is, what does it take to ensure a healthy existing nuclear fleet and deploy the promising new innovations? What does it take to be sure that we have the nuclear infrastructure and fuels for our fleet and advanced new reactors? And what does it take to assure America can lead the world and our allies and partners on nuclear and nuclear innovation? 69 years ago, Congress enacted the essential policies that can guide safe nuclear development in the United States and export abroad. The Atomic Energy Act of 1954 encouraged the widespread use of atomic energy for peaceful purposes, consistent with ensuring our common defense and public health and safety. With that policy, we led the world for several decades in developing civilian nuclear technologies and set the standard for safety. We must continue to build on this leadership to bolster our long-term nuclear competitive edge and strategic interest. If we don't lead, China and Russia will. China and Russia combined have already announced plans to construct an estimated 66 reactors in multiple nations. They're also working more closely on nuclear technologies, which raises more serious security concerns. America has also witnessed a weakening of our nuclear fuel infrastructure, building an unhealthy reliance on Russian-sourced nuclear fuels, a security problem intensified by the Ukraine invasion. What does it take to increase our own secure supplies? Excuse me. What does it take to enjoy the economic benefits of a domestic nuclear infrastructure? Despite Germany's poor decisions, other European nations, like I mentioned in Poland, are looking at American technologies. Closer to home, I've been following the work of Energy Northwest with innovative companies like X Energy. This work holds great promise for Eastern Washington, one of the early leaders in deploying nuclear technology, to once again lead in advanced nuclear generation. This is encouraging for a brighter and stronger future. This hearing is a solid first step for the committee in a strong bipartisan way to update our nation's regulatory policies that are necessary to restore American nuclear energy and to advance clean and secure energy here and around the world. And I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today and your suggestions. And I also want to just say I appreciate the bipartisan approach to this hearing and working with Ranking Member Dingell of the subcommittee and the full committee, Frank Pallone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And now I'll recognize the full committee ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for opening.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, for holding today's hearing, and I hope that today is a sign that we can work in a bipartisan manner on energy issues. Last Congress, this subcommittee spent a lot of time studying the power sector and our nation's electricity grid and how they impact the worsening climate crisis. And while the power sector has made significant progress in reducing carbon emissions over the last 2 decades, thanks in large part to the growth of renewable energy, it still accounted for 28% of the total carbon pollution in the United States in 2022. So, decarbonizing the power plants that keep the lights on in our homes and businesses is crucial to addressing the climate crisis. Now, nuclear power plays an important role in producing carbon-free power for the electric grid. Last year, nuclear power accounted for nearly half of all carbon-free power generated in the United States. In my home state of New Jersey, it supplies nearly 90% of the state's carbon-free power. Committee Democrats have long been committed to decarbonizing the power sector to combat the climate crisis and to lead the world in a clean energy transition. In order to achieve 100% decarbonization in the power sector while keeping prices low for consumers, we need reliable carbon-free resources that can sustain output for long periods of time, and nuclear power can meet this test. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has done an admirable job over the years ensuring nuclear power is safe and secure. The nuclear industry often touts its safety successes over the past decades, but that success is partly due to the efforts of federal regulators to stay on top of inspections and safety protocols at plants around the country. Last week, I joined Chairs Roger and Duncan and Ranking Member Dingell in a request for information asking nuclear power stakeholders for comments and recommendations on the NRC's licensing and regulatory process. It's important the committee hear from all interested stakeholders about any possible regulatory improvements that could make the process more efficient or to improve safety and security. Now, as we explore any possible changes, first and foremost, it's critical that they do not undermine the safety and security of our nation's nuclear fleet. Now, as we look at the licensing and regulatory process, I also want to take a moment to highlight investments Democrats and President Biden have made over the last 2 years in our nation's nuclear power industry. The bipartisan infrastructure law authorized the Civil Nuclear Credit Program, a $6 billion fund at the Department of Energy to support our existing nuclear fleet. And these investments will help support continued operation of nuclear facilities to prevent increases in carbon pollution from the power sector. Then, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, we created a tax credit for zero-emission nuclear power and invested $700 million in a program originally established by this committee in the Energy Act of 2020 to support next-generation nuclear fuel. The Inflation Reduction Act was the single largest investment in climate action in American history. It's going to finally allow us to begin to protect our communities from the impact of worsening climate crisis while also creating new clean energy jobs and lowering energy costs for American families. So I'd like to see this committee work together to build on the progress we made during the last Congress. That's why I appreciate the bipartisan nature of this hearing today and hope that we will see more hearings where both sides of the aisle can work together. And with that, Chairman Duncan, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member, and that will conclude the member opening statements. I want to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. So now it's time to dive in. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before this subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give 5 minutes opening statement, followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today, Dr. Gehin, Associate Laboratory Director, Nuclear Science and Technology at Idaho National Laboratory, was recognized and introduced by Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Regis Repko is Senior Vice President, Generation and Transmission Strategy at Duke Energy. Mr. Armond Cohen is the Executive Director of Clean Air Task Force, and Mr. Jeremy Harrell is Chair of the Board of Directors for the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council and Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath. So, gentlemen, we appreciate you being here today, and I'll now recognize Dr. Gehin for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
All right, thank you very much, Chairman Duncan, Vice Chairman Curtis, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here and a privilege to be here today. I've already been introduced. I'm Jess, Associate Laboratory Director for Nuclear Science and Technology. I appreciate Representative Fulcher's introduction, so I'll just proceed with my comments. As we look to the future of nuclear energy in the United States, I'd encourage members of this committee to consider the following questions to enable America's nuclear expansion. First, how do we leverage our existing nuclear industry to ensure domestic energy security? Our current fleet of 92 reactors, soon to be 94, operating reactors provide a tremendous resource for us. A key imperative ensure that these reactors continue to provide clean and reliable power. To do this, we need to ensure our plants are not subject to economic variations that can result to them being shut down prematurely, which we've had several that have been in that situation. We also need to extend their operating lifetimes to continue to get the value and clean energy from these investments. Second, our reactors require a reliable supply of uranium and enrichment services. We've already heard some of that in the opening statements. Currently, our nation imports 90% of our uranium needed for our reactor fleet. This includes imports from Russia. Eliminating these imports from Russia require us to establish an expanded uranium enrichment capability domestically and with our close allies. Second question is, how do we ensure successful deployment of nuclear energy new nuclear energy that is critical to our energy security, global leadership, and climate objectives? The recent DOE report on pathways to commercial liftoff for advanced nuclear states that the domestic nuclear capacity has the potential to triple by 2050 and is key to meeting our clean energy goals. This ambitious goal requires us to aggressively develop, demonstrate, and most importantly, deploy nuclear reactors. To enable this, we must support the near-term reactor demonstrations. This starts with INL's plans to start up the first new reactor on the INL site in 50 years, a reactor called Marvel, by the end of next year. This is a small reactor, but an important step as it gives us the experience and shows that we can move reactors forward relatively quickly. This will be followed by several other reactor projects, first-of-time commercial projects. This includes the carbon-free power project being developed by UAMPS, which is a new-scale SMR, and other reactor demonstrations, including TerraPower's Nachum reactor in Wyoming and X-Energy's XE100 reactors planned for the deployment on the Gulf Coast, and there are others in the next decade. We must ensure a domestic supply of high-assay, low-enriched uranium. This high-assay, low-enriched uranium has a higher enrichment than is used in our current fleets, and we do not currently domestically produce that uranium. Expanding the deployments to meet this goal that I outlined of tripling our nuclear generation will require us to even expand much more our uranium supply and enrichment. And we should encourage the deployment of nuclear energy such that it's on a level playing field with other forms of generation. The Inflation Reduction Act provided technology-neutral credits that stimulate early deployments and will also likely improve access to finances, which is important for expanded deployment. Third question, how does nuclear energy support our national security interests? There's already been good comments on this. American ingenuity created the nuclear industry. It was invented in the U.S. The majority of the reactors around the world are based on U.S. technology. As a result, our safety and nonproliferation standards are the world standards. But as the nuclear industry in the U.S. has been stuck in neutral for decades, other nations have moved forward, notably China and Russia. Given the momentum that I just talked about with the demonstrations and the deployment, we have an opportunity to lead again and establish our world leadership in nuclear energy. Recent announcements, such as those in Poland for international deployments, are very encouraging, and we should increase our support for export of our technologies. Fourth question: how can regulatory processes be improved to accelerate deployment of nuclear plants? The United States benefits from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is viewed as the world leader. However, one of the most significant time and resource-intensive activities for new reactor developers is the NRC licensing process. The NRC is undertaking a new regulatory approach called Part 53. But what else can be done? There's other efficiencies that can be gained, reducing regulatory timeframes by looking at mandatory hearings, approaches to expedite environmental reviews, roles of bodies within the NRC, including the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards, NRC licensing processes that include more schedule certainty, and fee structures to reduce the burden. Finally, I'd like to close with some comments on the back end. We need to address our near-term, long-term spent fuel management responsibilities. We have the capability and knowledge to responsibly and safely manage spent fuel. Congress has directed DOE to use a consent-based siting approach in pursuit of federal consolidated interim storage for the nation's spent fuel inventory. However, the interim storage facilities of sufficient capacity cannot be constructed without revising the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, remove the prerequisite for the repository construction authorization. I'll also mention quickly, and then I'll close. Recycling remains a potential option for the industry and policymakers to consider. INL and other laboratories conduct research. More research is needed to improve the economics of recycling while addressing proliferation risks. So I'll stop there. Thank you and appreciate it.
Thank you. There will be a lot of questions. Ask the witnesses, just try to stay in 5 minutes, and we've got a lot to cover. Mr. Repko, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Regis Repko. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today representing Duke Energy, where I serve as the Senior Vice President of Generation and Transmission Strategy. I have 38 years in the energy industry experience, 31 in nuclear generation in a variety of roles, including having held a senior reactor operator's license at the Oconee Nuclear Station in Seneca, South Carolina. Duke Energy is one of the largest energy holding companies in the United States. We serve 8.2 million electric customers and 1.6 million natural gas customers across the Southeast and Midwest. We own 50,000 megawatts of energy capacity, including the largest regulated nuclear fleet in the country. Duke Energy is currently overseeing the largest clean energy transition in the industry. And I'm proud to represent the 28,000 Duke Energy employees that are leading this effort. As we continue lowering carbon emissions from electric generation, maintaining affordability and reliability for customers is critical. We plan to add unprecedented numbers and amounts of solar, energy storage, wind power to the grid, and as we continue to retire our aging coal fleet. However, we must have firm, dispatchable resources, such as nuclear and natural gas, to support renewable energy resources. Our customers depend on us, and we must not jeopardize reliability or affordability in this transition. Our nuclear generation is a vital part of Duke Energy's generation portfolio. Our nuclear fleet delivers more than 80% of our company's carbon-free energy today. While generation from renewables is increasing, the existing nuclear fleet continues providing baseload, carbon-free capacity that our customers need. We cannot achieve our nation's carbon reduction goals without nuclear power. Our 11 nuclear units provide about 50% of the electricity in the Carolinas and remain economic drivers for their communities, providing thousands of well-paying jobs, significant tax revenues, and partnership opportunities and benefits. To advance new nuclear, we see a need for certainty in 3 areas: in the area of licensing, fuel, and financing. In terms of licensing, it's both for the existing fleet and advanced reactor designs. Our licenses of our current nuclear fleet will expire between 2030 and 2046. Renewing our nuclear plant licenses for an additional 20 years will help ensure a reliable, carbon-free, cost-competitive power for our customers for decades to come. Duke Energy is closely monitoring the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's rulemaking on the generic environmental impact statement guidance, as we will rely on that guidance for future applications for our existing fleet. The NRC's adherence to this rulemaking schedule will be an important predictor of the needed regulatory stability. Congressional oversight of these matters is appreciated. In terms of looking forward to new nuclear, Duke Energy intends to build 8 gigawatts of new nuclear generation to meet our energy goals. We are working with industry groups, reactor technology companies, and leading research universities studying the deployment of advanced nuclear technology. Regulatory clarity is important in any utility's decision to move forward. Duke Energy looks forward to continuing to work with the nuclear generation industry and the NRC to develop the Part 53 licensing process so that it is effective and efficient and commensurate to the safety of the new reactor designs. Fuel certainty is an issue. Russia is the largest supplier of nuclear fuel worldwide. As the U.S. and its allies pivot from Russian nuclear fuel, there's not enough production capacity to satisfy long-term demand. And although Duke Energy has a diverse set of suppliers, both domestic and from ally nations, there's still a need to do more. And then financial certainty. First, I would like to thank Congress for funding the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, supporting reactor vendors to accelerate deployment and development of their designs. I'd also like to thank Congress for the IRA, which includes the production tax credits that support our existing nuclear fleet, as our customers will see the values of these credits flow right back to them. The IRA also supplies the clean energy PTC, the tax neutral credit, the technology neutral credit. So out of both of these, our bottom line, our customers will see lower electric bills because of the IRA production tax credits. So we see the potential for cost and schedule uncertainties with current estimates for reactor technologies. And we anticipate these cost reductions for successive projects will lessen as learnings are passed around from one project to the next. The federal government has an opportunity to accelerate deployments of new designs by reducing the risk of these first and early projects. This can be done through options such as federal insurance if projects were to exceed cost caps. We anticipate these types of programs would only be needed for the first several projects, but their availability to support decisions by utilities to commit to new projects is vital.
I'm going to ask you to conclude.
Yes, sir. In closing, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
I get that the subject of nuclear energy is very complex, and I understand going over a little bit, but let's try to stay within 5 minutes. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you very much. Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and honorable members of the subcommittee. I'm going to jump right in. It's the best of times for nuclear energy, and it's the worst of times, to borrow a phrase. On the one hand, this very hearing, the bipartisan nature of it, the experience that some members have had in Europe, my recent experience even in California, working on the Diablo Canyon plan, suggests that there's actually very broad support for nuclear energy as a climate and energy security tool. That's great news. We're in a different place than we were a few years ago on that issue. The problem is that we're just not moving at any scale and pace that's relevant to climate. To be relevant to climate, nuclear is going to have to be churning out something like 100 gigawatts per year globally. That's about in the range of where we were with coal and gas in a sustained way for a few years. We have to be really running at that scale. We're about 10 gigawatts a year, so we need to be 10x where we are, and we're just not there. We're nowhere near there. And so the thesis of my testimony is that we're going to need a very radical rethink of this sector. That's a radical rethink of the business model, of the way we regulate, the way we finance, and our international institutions. Because after all, the US is only 15% of global energy consumption and about the same amount of CO2. So what we do in the US really isn't going to matter to global climate or much anything else unless what we build and create is exportable and readily diffusible. So the key, we think, to this revolution, moving from 10 gigawatts a year to 100 gigawatts, is a very different ecosystem that could basically produce a commoditized, standardized product. Think about Boeings, not cathedrals, or Timexes, not handmade Swiss watches, which is what we're building right now. If we look in Georgia, for example, our $12,000 Vodal unit. Now, you also, not only do we need to be cost competitive, we also need to be able to deliver on time. We can't take a decade or two to deliver these units. We need to be out there in 3 to 5 years with very low risk. These things need to be financeable on near commercial terms and suitable for deployment in the developing world, as I said, where most of the energy growth is going to be. So how do we get there from where we are today, which is basically nowhere? In the testimony, we lay out a number of things that we think the U.S. can do to drive the innovation, not just the technical innovation, which we're really, really good at, not so great at regulatory innovation, not so great at financial innovation, at least in this sector. So we kind of have a laundry list in the testimony. I'll just hit a couple points that I think some of my fellow panelists are not going to hit or haven't hit. The first is that we need some sort of private-public collaboration to really build this commoditized product ecosystem, those Boeings. We don't have that right now. There has to be a rethink of standardization and commodity input. That's not an easy thing to do. It's going to take some big brains, but we need to do it. We need public policies that drive large orders, enabling repeat deployment of standardized designs. That's how you get the costs down. We can't continue to build one-offs that end up being last of kind. We need a comprehensive program to drive nuclear CapEx costs down below $4,000 per kilowatt. As I said, the Vodal units are 12. That's not going to work. We need to be in a very low cost range. We need also global initiatives because, as I said, what we do in the U.S. isn't really going to matter to climate over the long run unless we can do this for the rest of the world. So we list a number of reforms that are needed. We think there needs to be an international bank for nuclear infrastructure finance. We believe there needs to be some sort of international licensing authority or platform by which licenses can transfer from one region to another, and some mechanism for helping newcomer countries adopt this technology. We need a sandbox or an innovative licensed by testing environment in the U.S., which we don't have now. Importantly, we also need to look at how we regulate, and the question of low-dose radiation standards is at the heart of some of the dysfunction in regulation, in our opinion. The U.S. DOE was given authority and money to do this, and unfortunately, it's not moved that forward, and the Congress should be encouraging them to do so. Finally, a few other items that we mentioned, if we're going to scale up uranium mining at the scale that 100 gigawatts a year, we're going to need to ensure socially and environmentally responsible mining practices. And there's several other opportunities we highlight that I look forward to engaging on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that. Mr. Harrell, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the chair of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council's Board of Directors. The council represents more than 80 companies engaged in nuclear innovation and supply chain development. I'm also the chief strategy officer at ClearPath. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. American nuclear energy can power a clean and secure future if the U.S. seizes this moment. Global energy markets are demanding a carbon-free, reliable, secure energy source more than ever, and the U.S. nuclear supply chain is ready to deliver. This increase in demand has coincided with unprecedented private sector momentum. For example, American electricity providers are calling for 90 gigawatts of new nuclear power by 2050, doubling current capacity. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission anticipates at least 13 applications for new nuclear by 2027, and at least 8 U.S.-based companies have announced international partnerships in more than 10 countries. These data points underscore the U.S. is entering the era of deployment. Now we must show the world that we can bring projects in on time and on budget at scale. Thanks to Congress's support, particularly this committee, we've seen bipartisan nuclear policy wins like NEMA, NECA, and the Energy Act of 2020. The resulting tax incentives, NRC modernization, and public-private partnerships like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program are bolstering the interest of new investors and new customers, not just utilities, but chemical facilities, steel producers, and data centers. But there are 3 challenges this committee could tackle to further accelerate American nuclear expansion. First, secure the nuclear supply chain and end global reliance on Russia. Second, enhance the U.S.'s offerings for new American nuclear abroad. And third, improve regulatory predictability here at home. I'll start with the supply chain. From mining to enrichment, our nation is too reliant on Russia. About 95% of our uranium used in the US today is imported. Nearly 50% of that comes from Russia and Kazakhstan. Russia is the only source of large volumes of high-assay, low-enriched uranium, the fuel needed for many of our advanced designs, and Russia has been supplying more than 20% of our low-enriched uranium for our current fleet. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made it even more clear that the US and its allies must end the global reliance on the Russian nuclear sector now. To enable a private industry-led HALEU supply, the Biden administration must immediately launch the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Program, already authorized by this committee. Second, the US must enhance its offerings for American technology deployment abroad. Demand in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia has never been higher. Nations want affordable, clean, reliable, and secure energy, and unfortunately, China and Russia are filling that desire, building dozens of new reactors both within their borders and internationally. The United States and its allies should be the ones who establish these new 100-year partnerships, not China and Russia. New policies like the Bipartisan International Energy Act send a strong signal that the US will reestablish itself as a leader in the global marketplace, but Team America must do more with the tools available. For instance, in 2020, the Development Finance Corporation removed its restrictions on supporting nuclear power projects, but has been slow to promote American technologies. Similarly, the Exim Bank's China program provides financial support for wind and solar, but excludes nuclear. This week's US-Poland deal to support roughly 20 SMRs with $4 billion in loans, the agreement that the full committee chairwoman mentioned earlier, is a great first step, but the US must pursue this aggressive whole-of-government strategy to compete. Third, neither of these goals work if we do not modernize regulations here at home. To lead, the NRC must be structured and incentivized to license the next generation of new reactors. While the NRC is working to modernize, attract new talent, and further its technical understanding of new technologies, efforts that I commend them for, the Commission admits it will still struggle to review these new applications. Understandably so. 13 new applications in the next 5 years is unprecedented. To rise to that challenge, the Commission should do 3 things. 1, realign the NRC's processes for new technologies around their safety benefits and new applications, like clean heat and disaster relief. 2, increase review efficiency so it doesn't take years to come to a decision. And finally, be proactive. That means asking Congress for support and preparing to be a regulator that not only meets its safety mission, but also enables nuclear's role in our clean energy future. USNIC also applauds early House action with the Lower Energy Costs Act and stands ready to support a bipartisan deal that overhauls our nation's antiquated permitting system. Meaningful permit reform is essential to growing new American clean energy. In conclusion, this committee has an incredible record of bipartisanship in nuclear energy, and it's positioning the U.S. to lead the world in the deployment of affordable, reliable, clean energy. The challenge before us today is to double down on those efforts and further increase U.S. supply chain security and international competitiveness. USNIC and ClearPath greatly appreciates what this committee has accomplished and stand ready to support your efforts in the months ahead. Thank you.
I thank all the witnesses. Well, now that concludes the witness testimony. Now I'll move into the question portion, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I and several of my colleagues, as the chair mentioned, on this committee just returned from Europe, where several of our meetings focused on nuclear. I'm optimistic about the partnerships we can make to advance the safe deployment of civilian nuclear globally. To foster these partnerships, the United States must work to advance our domestic industry. For a variety of reasons, it's important that we continue to advance nuclear energy in the United States. And as Assistant Secretary Huff recently said at an Atlantic Council announcement on the Poland project, deploy, deploy, deploy. Now we need to determine how to achieve that deployment of nuclear here at home, nuclear technology across the globe. So I'd like to ask Mr. Repko, Duke is responsible for providing affordable and reliable energy to many of my constituents and many more throughout the country. What will it take for utilities to put orders in for new reactors?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chairman Duncan. I laid out the 3 priorities for us, right? The licensing certainty, certainly the fuel certainty for the entire fleet. But for Duke Energy, it really comes down to that financial certainty. We have introduced nuclear in terms of our generation of resource planning to our regulators in North Carolina, and they are supportive of it. So much so is they've approved for us to begin incurring costs around early site development for new nuclear. But as you point out, everybody wants to be second, right? A fast second follower to save that risk. Matter of fact, our North Carolina Commission recognized and endorsed us being a second follower relative to managing the risk to the customer. So I think it's those kind of financial constructs that are laid out well in the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff that the DOE issued last month. There's a number of different avenues or programs that can be put in place, whether it be direct grants that would lower that cost of energy, or more of the cost share relative to these first few projects that would have some kind of federal insurance above a certain cap and cost share between customers or investors alike. If we were to have that in place, it would put new nuclear not even at an equitable cost, but a competitive cost relative to the value that it adds in other aspects, we would have the support of our regulators relative to moving faster as well.
Thank you for that. I would ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a report from the Department of Energy, Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, Advanced Nuclear. It's a really chock-full paper, and so without objection, so ordered. It mentions SMRs, advanced reactors, in this report. So, Mr. Harrell, advanced reactors will be critical for the future of energy in the United States. We need to modernize our regulatory framework. NRC's put an effort into preparing for the initial advanced reactor applications, but how will they need to rethink their licensing and oversight roles to accommodate these new technologies?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's a great question, and thank you for your leadership on these issues. And I think having and really pressuring them to really rethink how we do this is going to be important. Advanced reactors have a lot of different attributes than our traditional gigawatt scale reactors. They're more flexible, they're smaller, they can be paired to provide heat to industrial facilities just like it could be used for electricity generation. And there are a lot of different dynamics that the NRC needs to consider in that vein, right? We don't need the significant security zones, for example, like a gigawatt scale reactor does. And so, and changing and making the emergency preparedness zone smaller for a small modular reactor makes a lot of sense and actually would reduce costs without any loss in safety or security. The ability to streamline the deployment of more reactors because we're going to build multiple of them in a package, right? The new scale package in many cases are 8 to 12 small modular reactors to have a power facility. X-energy is 4 reactors, things along those lines. We need to be able to site those more quickly. That way we can scale these technologies abroad. So really they need to rethink and really put forth a process that accommodates the natural attributes that these new reactors have.
Mr. Gehin, what are the regulatory costs to a new reactor applicant faces when they're going through the licensing process at NRC?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So what are the regulatory costs a new reactor applicant faces when going through the licensing process at the Nuclear Regulatory
Is
Commission?
this the regulatory cost? Is that what you said? Yeah, so, there are fees. When you go to license a reactor, you usually go through a pre-licensing phase. You go through the topical submissions. Those all are costs, borne by the applicant that the NRC charges. In addition to that, there's, the reactor design has to be a sufficient mature level to go through that. So there's a lot of cost on design that's indirect that needs to be done, but has to be done in advance before the licensing.
What would you say is the percentage and the overall cost of a reactor project? What's the percentage of regulatory application fees and compliance versus construction costs?
For a large, and maybe Mr. Repko can comment on that for large plants. Of course, large plants cost more money, so that percentage is pretty small. But as you get to these small reactors like we're advocating for, microreactors and small reactors, you can get to...
The economies of scale will kick in at that point, once you get the first one approved, right? They'll get cheaper
but
as they
for
go.
the first one, there's significant costs, so you have to get past this first one. I don't have an exact percentage number, but it can be quite high, and it can be a barrier to get through. That's why some regulatory reforms, such as eliminating costs for pre-licensing applications, remove barriers to get those small, particularly those smaller ones, moving into the regulatory process.
Yeah. I'm out of time, so we'll now go to the ranking member to get for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for your excellent testimony. As the chairman referenced, all the leadership of the subcommittee sent a letter actually to the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council on April 14th, asking for comments on how we could improve the regulatory process. But, and so, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put that letter in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I'm assured by counsel that we would like to, even though this is directed at Mr. Harrell's group, we would like to have comments from everybody because we don't have time to get into all of the specific recommendations. But Mr. Repko, you said that you've worked through the renewal process. You're working through that right now with some of your facilities. And so I just want to ask you, do you see unnecessary approval processes that could be streamlined without sacrificing safety standards that are needed to protect public health and safety?
Well, thank you for that question.
Yes or no will
Yes,
work.
we do. We
Thank you. And Mr. Harrell, the same question for you, for your industry.
Could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. Do you see unnecessary approval processes that could be streamlined without sacrificing the safety standards that are needed to protect public health?
Absolutely.
And safety? So what I would ask of you and everybody else, it's all well and good to sit here in this hearing and talk in general about that, and we all agree in a bipartisan way, but where the rubber hits the road is when you look at the specific proposals. So I would ask everyone if they could please submit specific recommendations, so as Mr. Duncan and I sit and think about how to do this, we can see exactly what can be done. And that goes to my next point, which is about the waste. So I've been on this committee since 1997, and you don't have to do the math, that's fine. But I will say, we have been talking about what we're going to do about nuclear waste ever since well before I got here. And I think one of the issues that we have in the whole nuclear industry, but also particularly with waste, is we don't have any clear sense of what to do that we can give to the industry, and therefore it makes it really hard to make business decisions. As Mr. Repko said in his written testimony, regulatory clarity is important in any utility's decision to move forward. And so, one time I went down to Yucca Mountain with Joe Barton when he was the chairman of this committee. We're all looking around and it looked pretty remote to me, but we were still going through the scientific process. And then, with whichever party took over Congress, then it was either certified or decertified, and it was based on politics, not on science. We need to get beyond that. And so what I want to do is help develop some certainty about what we do around this waste, because for public health and safety reasons, we need to figure out what we're going to do. And right now, Dr. Catherine Huff of the Department of Energy, Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy, said there are only 76 interim storage sites in the United States. That's clearly not going to work if we're going to actually include nuclear energy as part of our portfolio. So I want to just ask you all a very brief question about this. And I'll start with you, Mr. Harrell. In your work, in your industry's work, has the lack of a comprehensive strategy to store spent fuel impacted your members and the industry?
Absolutely has, and it's an opportunity that I think that we can turn on a dime and ultimately deal with this issue and grow the industry as a whole.
And what about you, Mr. Repko? Same question to you. Has that impacted your company's ability to do this?
It has. There are operational resources necessary to store the fuel on site.
And Mr. Gehin, what have you seen to this effect?
Yeah, so, we're being a DOE research lab. We primarily look at the future research, and I can support your statements here on the scientific basis. That's what we do. We do science and want to have that strong basis. I think we can achieve that. I agree that it's the policy issues need to be resolved. DOE is also working on this consent-based siting approach for consolidated interim storage that will address the 76 or 77 sites.
Your participation in this, your agency's participation is going to be critical as we move forward. And finally, Mr. Cohen, I don't want to leave you out. What are your thoughts on this?
We're not from the industry, but it definitely
No,
is
I
a
know.
public perception barrier. That's the argument that I, oddly enough, get most common when I advocate for nuclear energy is, what about the waste? We know it's a manageable problem. It's not rocket science. Sweden and Finland are moving forward. In fact, Finland's starting to put things in the ground. It's a question of public perception and politics, and the consent-based siting approach is the way you do it. It's the way Sweden and Finland have been able to move as far as they have. So we need to reboot. we have to reboot the process.
I've been to Sweden and I've seen what they're doing there. It's incredible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working on this further.
Yeah, those are great questions, and we plan to have a hearing on reprocessing nuclear waste. It sits at 121 sites, 39 states around the country. So commercial waste, and there's defense waste included. So we're going to have a hearing on that. That's my plan. I now go to the chairwoman, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To restore America's nuclear leadership, we also must have strong and secure supply chains, especially for nuclear fuels, to meet the needs of American industry and innovators. We must confront current nuclear fuel security and vulnerabilities, which have been caused by outdated policies that allowed our nuclear fuel infrastructure to atrophy to unacceptable levels. And certainly this has become clear in wake of the Ukraine war. This exposed the risk of reliance on Russia for a large portion of America's enriched nuclear fuels. 3 years ago, in the Energy Act of 2020, Congress took steps to limit Russia's imports to 15% of American supplies by the end of the decade. But the invasion shows that more must be done, so we don't fall into the same trap as Germany did for natural gas supplies, and so that U.S. tax ratepayers no longer support Russia's malign regime. So my question, Mr. Harrell and Mr. Repko, you both acknowledge the need for to enable enhanced domestic supplies and diverse supplies beyond the federal investments you mentioned. How important is it to send a clear signal that a date certain America's nuclear industry can no longer rely on Russian-sourced low-enriched uranium?
Thank you, Congressman McMorris Rogers, and it's a great question, and I think it is an extremely important piece of the puzzle to provide some certainty and ensure that the companies can make multi-$100 million investments to ramp up enrichment capabilities here in the United States and with our allies. I think it's telling. We saw out of the G7 just yesterday, our allies, the UK, Canada, the French, and the Japanese all coming together and say we need to wane all of our reliance off Russia together, and so we should work together as like-minded countries and kind of take a stand and say that we're going to end this reliance moving forward.
Well, would you speak to what it would mean for supply contracts and investments into new facilities, too?
I would say probably Mr. Repko, as an operator of the existing fleet, is probably better suited to answer that question.
Okay, thank you.
Be glad to. Thank you for the
Okay.
question. So first off, it's absolutely a risk. You know, as we take a look at our portfolio in terms of fuel, currently our production is around 5% domestic, growing to 14% next year. But that's really at the upper end of the availability domestically. The conversion process is this is Duke Energy I'm speaking to, is roughly 50% domestic, again, due to limitations. Now, all of our fabrication is domestic. So that's kind of the portfolio that we're in. But to the point being made, the domestic capacity around the production and conversion is limited. So the perspective I would give, though, that the 2028 relative to permitting, constructing, and getting these kind of facilities operational, it's right around the corner. I mean, action needs to happen immediately in order to progress to that goal.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Gehin, I wanted to turn to you also. We just returned from Europe, and we saw the excitement for deploying not only large conventional reactors, but also advanced small modular reactors. To assure that American technology continues to lead, can you describe the importance of licensing and deploying advanced nuclear here in the United States? And how does that strengthen our ability to compete globally against Russia and China?
Yeah, great question. You know, by constructing the reactors in the United States, we demonstrate our trust and confidence. We get the first one. It was mentioned. The first one is always a hard one. I can give you a good example with NuScale and the carbon-free power project. You know, they announced their project out in Idaho several years ago. When we talk to Romania, Ghana, Poland, other countries that are interested in that technology, they point to that reactor as a showpiece and come to Idaho specifically because that reactor is going to be there. So it's a huge boost in confidence, attraction, gives us the ability to demonstrate to other countries that we are leading. And that's just the first one. These other demonstrations I mentioned will do exactly the same thing. So it's vitally important. It's also important because we develop the supply chains, we develop the talent, the expertise, the capability that then will will support all these broad international deployments. We'll develop that here in the U.S. rather than internationally.
Would you also speak to the current timelines for some of these projects that you're working
Yes.
on and how an improved regulatory process would?
Yeah, well, the current time frames we're looking at for various reactors, there's the smaller microreactors that'll happen in the next 3 to 5 years. The larger reactors, the SMRs, we're looking 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030. Those will be licensed under current regulatory processes, mostly by taking exceptions in other aspects. It's going to be hard to impact their licensing timeframes. I think we need to look at the licensing that's going to really blossom to get to the deploy, and get us to where we're getting 10 to 20 gigawatts per year deployed in the U.S. maybe in the 2030s, late 2030s timeframe. So we need to be looking for that deployment stage.
Thank you. Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan. And let me thank our witnesses. In my opening statement, I discussed the need for carbon-free generation resources that can sustain output for long periods of time. So let me ask Mr. Cohen, you spent a lot of time discussing this concept in your written testimony. Could you elaborate on the importance of these long-duration power generation assets, particularly as to why they're important to make decarbonization of the power sector more affordable for consumers?
Yes, thank you, Member Pallone. So as I detail in the testimony, wind and solar are great resources. They're cheap. They've gotten a lot cheaper. The problem is it's not just a daily fluctuation problem. It's a seasonal problem. Anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, we're talking about months where we have solar or wind output at about half peak. So you can see the problem. If it were a daily fluctuation problem and, just the wind doesn't blow all the time and obviously the sun goes down, we could manage that with battery storage pretty easily, 4 8-hour storage. The problem is when you've got December or you've got, January, February where you've got no solar energy, something needs to fill that gap. And so that's all the modeling that's done typically combines the variable sources, wind and solar, because when they're there, they're cheap, but usually building on a base load of nuclear or something else, carbon capture, something else that's zero carbon to offset that variability. It's a solvable problem, but again, the basic physics are it's not a daily issue we're dealing with. It's seasonal, and that's why you need something that's steady 24/7, 365 at the base of the system.
Well, thank you. Now, last week I mentioned in my opening, I sent out a request for information letter with Chairs Roger and Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, and we asked for comments and recommendations on the NRC licensing and regulatory process. And I know our witnesses haven't had enough time to develop a formal response to this letter, but I wanted to get some initial feedback. So again, with Mr. Cohen, I know that Ms. DeGette mentioned this, but if you could just maybe elaborate a little bit, and that's the industry's desire to make the licensing process simpler, but concern that we have that that be done without jeopardizing public health and safety. Can you just maybe give me a couple examples? I know she asked the question, but if you could just elaborate and maybe give me some examples.
Sure. Well, in the testimony and in comments we filed with the NRC, we think there is an approach, and it's an approach actually taken by other countries like South Korea, Canada, the UK. We call it kind of the less is more approach, in which you're not requiring, you don't have a rule book that's 1,400 pages with a bunch of box ticking. You're basically requiring the applicant to come forward and make a safety case. And what we've recommended to the NRC is that they rethink what they're doing and say, basically, let's strip it down and say, what are the essential output issues? What are the essential metrics that we're going to judge safety by? And then let the applicant say how they're going to fit in with that. Don't require them to, tell you about some valve that has no relevance to safety because it happens to be some vestige in a rule book. So it's a flexible approach, but it's tied to actual safety metrics rather than a laundry list of things. That's as simple as I can make it. There's a lot of detail in the testimony and in our comments that we'd be happy to supply, but that's how you thread the needle. You hold very firm on safety, but you allow flexibility in how those metrics are met.
All right, and last question, I mentioned again, in my opening about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, grants, tax credits for the existing nuclear fleet, and also funding for developing next-generation fuel. Could you just discuss the impact of these new programs and where there are maybe additional federal funding needs? Again, you, Mr. Cohen.
So we think there are a couple of areas. One would be the potential for the U.S. government to become a purchaser at scale. I mentioned the need to get scale and build many versions of the same unit over and over again, which is how we get the cost down. So having the federal government step in as a purchaser, whether through DOD or other agencies, would be a good first step. Providing, it was alluded to, some kind of insurance against market risk. So for example, something like a contract for differences could be an interesting mechanism, which is what the UK used to get offshore wind costs down. And then in addition, Mr. Pallone, there are a variety of things we think we can do on the innovation front that I wouldn't describe as large expenditure items, but things like we should have a program that drives costs down, that examines where are we getting stuck in the process that drives the reactor costs up, and what can we do by way of innovation to drive those costs down. So those would be three examples of, I think, where additional federal money could help.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I'll now go to Dr. Burgess from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cohen, let me just stay with you in the line of questioning that Ranking Member Pallone was just pursuing. So Texas has Comanche Peak, which is not in my district, but not very far away. I've been fortunate enough to visit there. They're very impressive, and the operations are very impressive. So I think the phrase used was, you don't want to have a vestige in a rule book. So the question I would have is about the evolving of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations to revolve to reflect the actual safety performance that's been historically exhibited. Is that something that you had in mind with your reference to the vestige in the rule book?
Yeah, in a way. I think the reality is we've got a bunch of new advanced designs coming forward, so it probably wouldn't be the right thing to do to say, because the large light water reactors have proven safe, we can assume that all these other reactors are safe. It does suggest, though, that you could have a much more outcomes-based process that will be a lot simpler. The idea, again, is set a boundary, exposure limit or whatever the right metric is. We detail some of those things in our testimony, and have a back and forth and allow several pathways for the applicant to meet that requirement.
It just seems like it should be a learning exercise. And I mean, the country has a long history with the nuclear navy and a long history of safety, a lot of data and experience to go on. It just seems like the learning from a regulatory agency should be part and parcel of what they do. You build on what your experience was.
Absolutely, and we make, in the testimony, we make two specific recommendations on that line. One is that the rule itself should be evolving, so as applicants come forward with novel solutions, those should be explicitly kind of built in as pathways that the regulators may not have thought of. And the second idea is license by testing, that there should be more ability of, and we don't have the details in the testimony, but that if we could be testing things in situ and having the regulator involved and looking at things being dispatched or built in real time and looking at the performance, that could really speed things along.
Now, as a practical matter, do you envision that that's possible to do that in real time?
Absolutely. There's nothing preventing us. And in fact, in the early days of the nuclear program, as I think my fellow witness will attest to, we did much more of that at Idaho. We had, several dozen, I think, reactors being demonstrated. What would be different about our proposal is that you would have the regulator quite involved with an eye towards commercial licensing on site and actually thinking about it as, okay, it's not just does the thing work, it's like how are the safety metrics performing?
Yeah, if I could comment, we tested 52 reactors on the INL site over a 25-year period. Many of these were specifically doing tests to support the light water reactor fleet and enabled that. I think as we, I talked about these demonstrations we're considering and the test facilities we have. We can do testing in our nuclear facilities. We can do demonstrations on DOE sites. Maybe that's a good place to do those demonstrations and get that experience. So I agree with your comments. We have, decades and decades of operational experience, civilian, government, and that should be factored in for sure.
Right, it seems like there should be a continuous learning and updating exercise. Let me just ask you a question, probably Mr. Repko, and you too, Dr. Gehin. This committee 20 years ago did the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and the idea was that we were going to help with the funding for, in the case of Comanche Peak, they have 2 reactors on site, but they've got a footprint that would permit 2 more. So the idea was to help them with the funding. Now, I get it, the world changed with fracking and inexpensive natural gas, and suddenly the electrons could not, the performance was not quite the same as what the pricing had indicated that it might be. But again, as a practical matter going forward, is that something we can relook at? And is that something that you're doing, Mr. Repko, with your energy?
Yes, Congressman, that's absolutely something we can look at. As we see it right now, as I said, we, just to meet our clean energy goals right now, we'll have to build 8 gigawatts of new nuclear. So, even beyond that, mandates around relative to the risk of other resources, we can certainly do that in terms of just additional goals, right? Mandates relative to nuclear in terms of energy security, other type of aspects like that.
Sure. What happens to those licenses when they didn't build? Do they still exist?
The licenses can be maintained in terms of construction licenses, but generally they are surrendered, they expire.
I see. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Now I'll go to Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I really appreciate this hearing, and thank you for the witnesses. When done right, I support nuclear energy as a clean energy source that has the potential to play a very significant role at decarbonizing our power grid. However, we cannot build a new fleet of advanced nuclear reactors and continue to dodge the question of what we do with spent fuel and other radioactive materials. 88,000 tons of spent nuclear fuel is currently stranded at reactor sites around the country, including the decommissioned Rancho Seco nuclear generating station in my district. Rancho Seco closed in 1989, and the spent fuel is still awaiting transport to a consolidated storage facility. That's why I've led appropriations letter in support of DOE's interim storage program and why I lead the Store Nuclear Fuel Act. We need a solution to this problem, especially if we're going to be starting to build more nuclear power plants. And believe me, I know we've been having this conversation here, but we hear about it all the time. If there's this type of hurdle, we need to really address it. The cost. Mr. Repko, according to the latest Nuclear Waste Fund audit report, the temporary storage of spent nuclear fuel at decommissioned reactor sites has already cost taxpayers $10.1 billion, and the remaining additional liabilities will total $31 billion. Mr. Repko, how much does it cost Duke Energy to store spent nuclear fuel and other radioactive material from your operating and decommissioned nuclear power plants?
To date, we have received $780 million from the DOE due to the government not meeting its obligation relative to take up, national storage of used nuclear fuel. So that's across all of our sites starting in 1995 to date, $780 million.
Okay, thank you. Public concerns about waste. Mr. Harrell, nuclear power is and will likely continue to be a key part of the solution to climate change, but public questions about safety remain an important concern. Those questions include, what should we do about nuclear waste? Mr. Harrell, nuclear power has faced strong public opposition for a variety of reasons, which has led to plant closures in my district and around the world. If the nuclear industry hopes to see a renaissance, are you concerned that public opposition, including concerns about nuclear waste, could derail that renaissance?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question, and I agree with what Mr. Cohen said earlier. It's the question that we hear very frequently on the ground in the public, and it's a very solvable problem. I think no doubt we need a spent fuel storage strategy. It'll be multi-pronged, consolidating storage at least a repository, most likely multiple repositories across the country is going to be necessary. But also there's opportunities here as well. Some advanced reactors burn existing spent fuel so they can contribute to the solution. Our nation should be exploring recycling. 95% of the products those products' energy potential is not being utilized. So existing spent fuel stockpiles could actually be used proactively to improve fuel security.
Okay, you mentioned advanced nuclear storage designs. Dr. Gehin, advanced nuclear reactor designs and small nuclear reactors have the potential to address many of the challenges facing today's nuclear fleet. However, I understand these reactors will continue to produce hazardous waste. Dr. Gehin, can you briefly explain how spent fuel and other radioactive waste products produced by advanced nuclear reactors will differ from the current generation of reactors?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As we've been talking about, supply of enriched uranium, advanced reactors generally use higher enrichment uranium, high SALEU. So the enrichment will be higher. It'll be higher as you feed it in. It'll also retain more residual uranium, enriched uranium as you discharge it. It will also be a different form. Our current fuel form are ceramic pellets. We're looking at a variety of fuel forms for these advanced reactors, whether they're small ceramic coated particles, metallic fuel is a good example. So they will have a different form as well. The geometries will be different. Rather than the large array of pins, they could be smaller, could be pebbles. So there's some variety in that, as I just mentioned.
Okay, fine, thank you, and I've already reached my limit here on the time. Thank you, you're back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I'll go to Mr. Latta, who's having a birthday today. Happy birthday, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, you're too kind, Mr. Chairman. But thanks very much for holding today's hearing, and thanks for our witnesses for being here, because this is a really important subject, and as you can tell, this committee is very concerned with. Mr. Harrell, you cite in your testimony our nuclear fuel supply chain and our over-reliance on Russia for fuel that powers our current advanced reactors. I've long believed that nuclear energy can be a game changer. And for the United States, it's unfortunate we have surrendered our leadership and competitive edge in the nuclear fuel space. Alarmingly, 90% of the uranium purchased for U.S. Use in the United States reactors today is produced by foreign countries, including Russia. I ask you unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to include in an article from Nuclear Newswire that highlights these issues entitled "On the Verge of a Crisis: The U.S. Nuclear Fuel Gordian Knot." And Mr. Harrell, what are the implications if we don't do anything to address this problem and the U.S. continues to be reliant on Russia and Russia-aligned nations for nuclear fuel?
Thank you, Congressman, and a happy birthday, and appreciate the question. We potentially, if we fail to invest in the U.S. supply chain, we could reach this catch-22, where we have really exciting commercial technologies that both can improve affordability, reliability, and our national security in this country, and can allow us to reassert ourselves with global leadership and really push to compete with Russia and China in the global marketplace and deploy in countries like in Africa, in the regions like Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And so, frankly, our failure to do so has the likelihood of both threatening our national security and threatening global energy security. And the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has only further accentuated that point.
Okay, just follow up on something you said. We failed to invest in our United States supply chain. What's holding us back?
Ourselves.
Again, but why?
We need to make some smart long-term investments that take matters into our own hands, so that we and our allies can both mine, can produce, and enrich our resources here at home or within our kind of like-minded allied countries. And then ultimately, I do think the regulatory barriers are going to be a problem here in the U.S. We need to modernize the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I am worried that we're going to have cutting-edge technologies that aren't able to get through an antiquated regulatory system. We need to lead by doing. As I mentioned in my testimony, it's the era of the deployment, and we need a regulator that's nimble and ready to deploy these exciting tech.
Well, I introduced H.R. 1086, which is the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, and this legislation is the House companion to the bipartisan bill introduced by the senior senators from West Virginia and Wyoming, and that bill would establish the Nuclear Fuel Security Program to increase the quantity of low-enriched uranium and high-assay low-enriched uranium produced by U.S. nuclear energy companies, expand the American Assured Fuel Supply Program to ensure the availability of domestically produced, converted, and enriched uranium in the event of a supply disruption. You never know when that might happen. And then also establish that HALEU for Advanced Nuclear Reactor Demonstration Projects Program. Again, Mr. Harrell, how important is it for Congress now to act and pass this legislation like this the bill that I have to send signals needed for the industry to respond and build up our domestic capacity, and I hate to say it this way, in a timely manner?
It's an urgent priority, Congressman, and I should give you kudos. I know you've been talking about this issue for many years, and I think the Ukraine issue has brought it even more to the forefront. As I mentioned, 13 new reactor companies to come before the NRC by 2027. We need to start ramping up our enrichment capacity, our HALEU domestic production capacity now, so we have time to license those facilities, to build them, and then provide the fuel needed for this new wave of reactors. There are a bunch of exciting companies that are all looking at deploying here in the U.S. by the late 2020s and early 30s. If we don't make the investments now, we may have this catch-22 fuel situation, which would be really catastrophic for both our security interest, our economic interest, and ultimately our emissions goals as well.
Well, thank you. Mr. Repko, how important is it for Duke to have certainty over fuel sourcing as you look to implement your carbon plan and meet your customers' needs?
It's absolutely critical. As I talked about, 8 gigawatts. So if you think about that, that's over 20 SMRs or, the small advanced reactors. And you typically put those in sites of 4 to 5 at a site just for economies of scale. But to sustain that operations for that energy output, it will be absolutely critical to have that sustained supply.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do thank you for holding this hearing. I want to associate myself with many others' comments on the importance of nuclear as part of our energy mix, and we especially should recognize and support nuclear energy for being such a large zero-emission resource contributing to our climate and clean energy goals. So, Mr. Cohen, your testimony mentions there have been several studies that found achieving a net zero electricity system will be much more difficult and expensive without nuclear as part of that mix. How can nuclear reduce system-wide costs in the clean grid of the future, even if individual projects look expensive today?
Right. Well, as I explained earlier, the fundamental way that nuclear reduces system costs of a zero-carbon system is by not requiring a massive overbuild of renewables. If you rely, for example, only on wind and solar, you would have to build enough wind and sun to meet your peak demand, which might be 4 or 5 times the average demand in some cases. So by having an always available source, you reduce the need to have that massive overbuild plus storage, and that's just a cost savings. Every study almost that's out there will prove that, and we put a couple in the testimony. That's the fundamental driver. It's the ability to have 24/7, 365 without a massive amount of capital expense to meet the most stringent day.
And you've also discussed an ambitious vision for the U.S. nuclear industry of mass producing and deploying advanced reactors. Why is that level of ambition necessary?
Because if we don't really get to a mass-produced model, we're going to continue to build these one-offs, and the costs are going to be very, very high. Every time that, and to be fair, there's no country that's done this. We're not building Boeings anywhere in the world, using that analogy. So this is difficult. We need to think about how do we sort of incent that kind of mass-produced, factory-built kind of model. And I think we can do that with federal incentives to say that the kinds of things that the federal government is going to support are going to be things that look like the Boeings, not the cathedrals. That's the key on the policy side.
Thank you. And there have been several major incentives enacted recently in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and certainly the Inflation Reduction Act to support both new and existing nuclear projects. This builds upon existing programs like DOE's Title 17 loan program, which was critical to the development of the Vogtle project. So, Mr. Cohen, would the vision you have outlined be possible without a fully committed U.S. government offering its support to project developers, and just how important are these federal incentives?
Well, these are great steps forward, and nothing in my testimony should detract from the fact that the IIJA and the IRA have made a huge difference in terms of the interest from the investment community, among other things. What I would say is that you would need to build on that, because to build a a gigafactory, if you will, for nuclear is going to take a lot more than just a production tax credit or investment tax credit. So there needs to be a strategic approach to actually building that supply chain and that capability. And that is something that really hasn't been addressed in current legislation.
Okay, and Mr. Harrell, I believe ClearPath has also worked on and supported several of these incentives, including support to protect and expand the Loan Programs Office. What do you see as the federal government's role in supporting the growth of our domestic nuclear industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Loan Program Office, cost share programs like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that do a 50-50 cost share to deploy the very first of a kind technology, and tax incentives like an investment tax credit are important tools in the tool belt to offset the original cost. Mr. Repko was mentioning no one wants to be the first to build these, right? They want to be second, third, or fourth. Programs like the ARDP or the LPO program are really important to make de-risking that first build so that we can show that we can build it, and then ultimately be able to then get the learnings from that and drive down the cost. I think that's going to be really important for the future of nuclear.
Thank you. And over the years, this committee has taken a lot of time to examine nuclear waste issues, which, given the long-term uncertainty for disposal of waste, remains a significant economic and social risk to future growth of the industry. I heard Representative Matsui quizzing about this, but can anyone provide more context on how these new advanced reactor designs may help limit or address waste challenges?
Yeah, maybe I'll make a few comments on that. So the advanced reactors, many of these advanced reactor types can, while you feed them with high-assay LEU or higher enrichments, they can actually burn the fuel more in situ, so you generate less used fuel per unit energy produced. Maybe longer term, especially some of the what we call fast reactors have the capability to actually burn waste. So if we do the research on recycle or in situ burning, we can actually burn the fuel deeper. If you go far enough to continuous recycle, you can reduce the waste burn by maybe up to order of magnitude, but there's a lot of research that would need to be done to get to that point.
Okay, thank you very much. I went over my time, so I thank you for being generous, Mr.
Gentlemen, time's expired. I'll now go to Mr. Griffith from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me make a slight correction to Mr. Harrell. I come from Virginia. Governor Youngkin wants to be first. You were just saying nobody wants to be first. Governor Youngkin wants us to be first, and we've been debating all those issues. And interestingly, today in the Cardinal News, an online news service, Dwayne Yancey does a report where he talks to the head of the Virginia Tech Nuclear Engineering Department, and he says, even though Virginia is well-positioned, we have North Anna, we have Surrey Nuclear, we have Newport News Shipbuilding, which does all the nuclear submarines. We have BWX Technologies, about six or 7 miles outside of my district, maybe 10. They've also got a facility in Irwin, Tennessee, also just outside of my district, and my district's only about a little less than 2 hours from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So we think we're well positioned. And the professor comes out today and says, yeah, all the issues y'all have been discussing aren't the major one. The major one is workforce, finding the people who know how to build it and how to manage it is going to be the real issue. So can y'all talk about that and how we're going to be prepared? Because we've been thinking that with all the skilled fit folks that we have coming out of natural gas and coal production in the district, that we would have people who are used to energy and comfortable with it. but he says we don't have the workforce ready. So can y'all discuss that a little bit, the workforce to manage a small, and we're looking at small modular
Sure.
Reactor. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll start with
absolutely.
you, but I'm happy to get everybody's opinion.
Appreciate the question, and yeah, very, very exciting what's happening in Virginia now, and I think Virginia is very well positioned to be a leader in new nuclear. Your universities have robust nuclear engineering programs. They're trying to get at some of that training. Obviously, BWXT, big employer in the state, and really big driver. And it's one of the big upsides for nuclear, right? Like nuclear energy jobs pay much significantly higher relative to other energy industries, and their long-term high-paying jobs. And you mentioned the nexus with the national security side. It's a great, civilian nuclear is a great spot for our service members who've involved in Navy nukes, things like that. So once they leave the service to land in a high-paying industry that still has significant impact on our national security. And so I do think we need to be thoughtful about those types of investments. And so I think these universities are doing the right thing. The VNEC has made a lot of big moves kind of in advance of this moment.
Hang on, the V what?
The VNEC, the Virginia Nuclear Energy Commission. It's kind of the coalition in the state that over the last couple years have really wanted to make some of these investments to position the state well. And so I think those are going to be really important. The crux of it is we need projects. This is the era of deployment. Like, we need to attract new young people.
But if we build it, will there be people to build it, operate it, run it, and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to? That's the question.
Not yet, but I think all this excitement in the industry is giving us that moment.
Well, how long will it take to gear up? Because we're ready to, a lot of us are ready to go forward. I understand that not everybody in the state feels that way, but a lot of us do.
It's why some of these programs, so that we have more than just one project or big manufacturing facilities, are so important, because it gives long-term certainty to folks to come into this field. And so
what you're saying is that we as the federal government should incentivize a couple of projects in my district on this level.
and the state should as well. I think this Virginia Nuclear Energy Hub is a really great idea by Governor Youngkin, and I think will drive more investment
All right,
in the
my
state.
clock is running, but I did promise that I'd let all of you weigh. Anybody got anything to add on workforce?
I would echo much of what has been said, but I think, even beyond the operation, just the constructability, the workforce relative to those skills, that's an area I think Europe is ahead of us with their strong apprenticeship-type programs. But I do think the answer that Mr. Harrell said, creating the market first. The urgency with creating that market will subsequently develop those kind of programs, either through community colleges, apprenticeship programs. We have some of those in place right now at Duke around transmission skill sets, right, lineman skill set. That can expand.
We're not that far from Duke territory either.
And I understand.
Right, out in Southwest Virginia. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just gonna make one point. I agree with all this projects, everything, the demo projects, but we're finishing 2 large plants in Georgia. It'd be great if they were actually moving right on to the next plant. There's a lot of people that have a lot of experience that could just continue constructing plants, moving from one to one. A lot of them.
So we might be able to pick up some workers out of Georgia short term. We want them to come live and spend their money in our area.
Yeah.
Mr. Harrell, a lot of folks are concerned about, just being used by the nuclear industry as the next stop. What kind of investments do they make besides the good-paying jobs? What else can the community look for if we get a small modular reactor in the area?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say nuclear is the exact opposite. We've got a track record across the country, in your state, and in South Carolina as well, that nuclear is there to stay. These are 50, 60, 70-year projects. They invest in communities. They're contributing significant local tax resources. It's not an industry that comes in and out. The construction, obviously, there's a big uptick, but unlike the solar industry or the wind industry,
And the
nuclear
safety
puts
record's
people
pretty
on
good.
site.
My time's up. I'm going to have to yield back. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now go to Mr. Vesey from Texas, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thank the witnesses for being here as well. Last year, the power sector accounted for 28% of the total U.S. carbon dioxide pollution. If we're going to slash that figure, we need reliable carbon-free energy sources like nuclear that can sustain output for long periods of time, particularly while we work on things like battery storage, which we're making great progress on in Texas. According to the Energy Information Administration, nuclear power accounts for about 46% of the zero-carbon electricity generated here at home. In the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats created a tax credit of up to 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour for zero-emissions nuclear energy, and provided the DOE with $700 million to invest in increasing the availability of next-generation nuclear fuel for advanced reactors. And all of you have mentioned in your testimony, a significant priority must be enhancing the domestic supply chain for uranium and boosting the U.S. enrichment and conversion industry. What we have learned since the Russian-Ukraine conflict is that geopolitical events have complicated the supply chain for these materials even further, as a substantial portion of the supply comes from Russia and the Eastern European region. And I wanted to ask for anyone to answer this. Russian and Chinese nuclear companies, as we know, receive the full backing of their government when competing for export bids and projects in overseas markets. This integrated government support has made them very competitive in global markets and dominant in the nuclear energy supply chain. Despite this influence, recent research shows that the U.S. industry is well positioned to become a global leader in key parts of the value chain for nuclear fuel and the manufacturing of small modular reactors worth $180 billion plus in market value. What are we doing to ensure that we have the necessary technology and infrastructure to compete globally, and how can Congress best support such efforts so that the U.S. can lead the development of new nuclear reactors with the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation in the world? Anybody jump in?
I'm happy to start. As I mentioned, I think we need a whole of government approach. You're exactly right. China and Russia are willing to do 100-year partnerships with these countries. They're willing to build. They're willing to staff. They're essentially owner-operators. We're never going to get at that model, right? That's not the American way, and there's a lot of other inherent advantages to working with a country like the United States. But we do need to put in competitive financing packages. So things like this Poland announcement that happened yesterday, where we're putting loans from XM and Development Finance Corporation that we're willing to make fuel deals so that we ramp up our enrichment capacity and we can be a fuel provider to these countries as well. It's a really important piece of the puzzle, and if we don't do that, we're not going to compete with the Russias and Chinas, because when we're talking about a country like Ghana, for example, they want a partner that's going to ensure that they can deliver electricity to their people now to meet their needs. The U.S. can win those contracts. Ghana has every advantage to do it with the U.S., but we've got to be competitive with our offerings.
Yeah.
Mr. Veazey, we also suggest in our testimony that maybe the U.S. doesn't have to be the only party bearing the financial de-risking burden. So we recommend a creation of something called an International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure. The World Bank won't touch nuclear right now for a variety of reasons, but it's a world imperative. And so the proposal really here is that the coalition of the willing, not just the U.S., but other countries and other investors that want to see this technology go, should be providing, de-risking financing for global expansion. And American reactors could compete in that environment. So I don't know that we necessarily have to go it alone. We detail there actually is a proposal out there, quite concrete proposal, to create this multilateral bank that would do some of that work.
Yeah. Let me also ask Jeremy Harrell. I'd like to inquire about the synergies between DoD and DOE. I know that there have been some growing interests with the U.S. military to explore the use of advanced nuclear technologies to help power land bases at home or reliable energy assets in forward areas. As the interest increases and DoD-led projects move forward, what are the synergies between these efforts and those occurring within the commercial sector? And how can defense-led programs benefit the advancement of new nuclear technologies in the civilian sector?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congressman. So there's actually been a study that shows that there is roughly a $3 billion benefit of the civilian nuclear industry to our defense apparatus and vice versa. It's an interchangeable supportive organization. And so this program you mentioned, Project Pele, which gets at one critical issue that inflicts our service members abroad. So many deaths are related to diesel resources getting brought to troops on the ground and for deployments. This Pele project, for example, would use transportable reactors to take that diesel dynamic out and get at one of the single largest casualty risks that service members have in forward deployments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, time's expired. I'll now go to the Bluegrass State. Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, gentlemen, for yielding the time, the chair for the time, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Repko, this is kind of going to be directed at you, questions from you. In 2017, Kentucky actually, during the 3 Mile Island and all the other stuff, put in a nuclear ban when you couldn't do atomic energy in Kentucky. Finally, in 2017, effort of people I was in the General Assembly with and others, finally got it across the line when Governor Bevin was in office and rolled back our background. And there's been a really strong interest, particularly in Western Kentucky, in bringing nuclear power, including small modular reactors. And, you know, Kentucky obviously has historically been a energy-producing state, particularly coal. And state and community leaders see nuclear energy as a way to continue Kentucky's leadership as an energy-producing state and also improving reliability of our grid, which we struggle with. We actually had rolling blackouts in Kentucky in December because of some, I don't know, it's debatable, but I think some decisions on taking out coal-fired plants left us below our base load. So the question is nuclear, and my question for you is Duke Energy looking at converting old coal-fired plants into nuclear power plants, and what would be your considerations? And what are some performance features of new technologies that make it appropriate for you to invest in this type of thing?
So we are looking at siting new technologies, new nuclear at existing sites. There are some technologies around retrofit of coal plants. Those are typically involve like storage type technologies, molten salt. But for where we're at right now, the existing retiring sites provide the best opportunities for deployment of new nuclear. So if you think about it, the water infrastructure is already there. The transmission interconnection and infrastructures, they're already paid for by the customer. And there are very generous incentives for replacement of generation and these. So that's how we are approaching in terms of utilizing existing or retiring facilities.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on that? Mr.
Yeah, if
Cohen?
I may,
Yeah.
there's an easy layup here, which is the government already has a lot of authorities as well as money through the IRA to move forward these coal to nuclear conversions. What we've yet to see from DOE, and I know they have a lot on their plate, is a kind of whole of government approach where you're kind of made to a one-stop shop to kind of like knit together the regulation, the funding, the planning support, all of that to make these things happen. It really is a great opportunity, as Mr. Repko said, and we've looked at this in detail. And you typically have good political support at the local community level. So again, there's a really gold to be mined there, and we just need to do it.
Appreciate it. Mr. Harrell, you say like you want to answer something?
Yeah, just
Well,
one quick thing I'll flag. It's low-hanging
well.
fruit for
Oh, and
regulatory
Mr.
reform.
Gehin next. Yeah, go ahead.
It's low-hanging fruit for regulatory reform. Like if we're building at brownfield sites, a lot of the dynamics of building a nuclear power plant and a coal plant, similar dynamics there. The NRC should make it a lot easier to
The transmission lines are already there, right?
Transmission line is already there. A lot of synergies that make things easier. And it's great for the workforce, too. A lot of these new designs, like TerraPower, for example, that's building their first project in Wyoming, they separate the nuclear power unit and the power plant operations. And so many of those coal workers could work at that power plant operations with pretty minimal training.
Yeah, I was just at TVA's plant in Paradise, in Muhlenberg County, if you know the song. But it was at Paradise, but they went from a coal plant that had 400 employees to a combined gas plant that has about 32, I think. So, I mean, it's just all automated. So sometimes that doesn't translate as well. Mr. Gay, Doctor? Gay?
Yeah, and what I wanted to add is certainly Kentucky is a great location for this. DOE did a study that identified about 80% of the coal sites could be converted to nuclear, and it would result in a 15 to 35% cost reduction in deploying nuclear plants by reusing some of the things that Mr. Repko talked about here. So there's huge opportunities in this space.
Thanks for adding that. And then one more, Mr. Repko, and for 30 seconds that I have. You mentioned in your testimony that Duke Energy has applied for license renewals for expiring license for one station have plans to do for other expiring licenses. Can you explain how these expiring licenses will be safely extended and continue to improve reliable and affordable energy, and what are your regulatory challenges? 20 seconds.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I will tell you that the age of these plants do not reflect their actual physical condition. There are constant replacements of valves, pipings, and things like that. Very few of the physical assets there, reactor vessel being one, which undergoes very extensive monitoring of that. But these are not ages, the equipment there is not the age of the plants. So, you know, in terms of that, we're really looking for the regulatory certainty around the GEIS to enable the future applications.
Ms. Custer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for hosting this hearing, Chairman Duncan. Until recent emergence of cheap solar and wind energy, there were two energy generation resources that provide the United States with the bulk of our carbon-free energy, nuclear and hydropower. These two energy resources are often thought of in the same breath. When the United States built out our nuclear energy fleet during the 1960s and 70s, we also built hydropower pump storage projects around the country to capture excess nuclear energy when there was not sufficient demand on the grid for that energy. I'm glad we're talking about nuclear energy today, Chairman Duncan, and I encourage you to hold a similar hearing on hydropower in the near future. Turning to the issue at hand, the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant in New Hampshire is responsible for nearly 3/5 of the electricity generated in my state. The facility is a source of reliable power and provides high-paying, high-skilled jobs. While nuclear energy plays an important role keeping the lights on, our nation is sadly too reliant on nuclear fuel imports from Russia. Russia provides nearly 14% of America's low-enriched uranium, which is the key component for nuclear fuel. And unconscionably, the proceeds from Russian fuel sales to the United States may be supporting Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Last year, Congress acted in an overwhelming bipartisan way and banned the importation of Russian oil and natural gas. Mr. Harrell, my first question is to you. Should Congress also ban low-enriched uranium imports from Russia?
I think it needs to be a piece of the puzzle as we provide some certainty for U.S. and allied providers and enrichers to move forward. We need the financial or the assurance that the Russians aren't going to flood the market and drive those investments out of business. I think it's a piece of that long-term picture.
And to Mr. Harrell and Mr. Cohen, in both of your testimonies, you touted the benefits of new advanced nuclear reactors. These new electricity-generating technologies have the potential to reliably produce power with fewer environmental externalities and safety concerns than existing nuclear technology. But I also understand that high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU, which is a critical fuel source for advanced nuclear reactors, also largely comes from Russia. Again, would banning the importation of Russian uranium help America and our allies win the future by creating an incentive to move this HALEU production to friendlier nations?
Yeah.
Sure. I think the biggest thing that we could do for HALO production here is to get the Biden administration to launch the Advanced Fuel Availability Program that this committee authorized in the Energy Act before. Launching that program, providing the initial certainty for companies to ramp up production of HALO can immediately challenge Russian dominance in this space. And so I think it's the biggest thing that we could do on that front. And we can ensure that the HALO problem isn't just like the LEU problem that we've got here.
Great. Would you like to add, Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think it's a supply side answer as well as the demand, managing the demand side. It might provide us additional incentive to do our domestic program, but we still need a lot of effort there. We've supported appropriations for the domestic HALEU program.
Great, thank you. And I have a follow-up question for you, Mr. Cohen. Can you describe one safety benefit of advanced nuclear reactors and how having a secure fuel supply for advanced nuclear reactors would help the U.S. realize those benefits?
Sure. Well, obviously, if we don't have the advanced fuels, we're not going to have the advanced reactors. But probably the most significant safety feature of many, not all of the advanced reactor designs is that they're not relying on water as a coolant or as a reaction moderator. The major accidents we've had, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, were all driven by loss of coolant, water boiling off, essentially. And not all of the designs have moderators or coolants that have much higher temperature thresholds. They can withstand a lot of runaway heat. So that's probably the single most significant safety attribute, which is the inability to have a runaway reaction that essentially melts through the core and the containment vessel.
Great, well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, there's bipartisan interest in banning imports of Russian uranium. It will make our energy supply chains more secure now and into the future, and I look forward to working with you to get this done. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Agreed, and the chair will now go to the chair of the Environment, Climate, and Critical Minerals Subcommittee, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say thanks to our panelists for being here with us today. You know, let me start by saying I'm very encouraged today. We disagree on a lot of things on this committee, but I do believe that bipartisan support for nuclear power hasn't been this strong since I've been in Congress for the last 13 years. And it's not a mystery why. The fact is that nuclear is the only, and I mean only, large-scale, reliable baseload carbon-free electricity source available to us. It's not going away, and the world needs more of it. The only question now is, will America lead in this critical energy sector, or will we cede our leadership to our adversaries like Russia and China? When Russia and China export their civilian nuclear technology to other nations, it gives them a near century-long foothold. I don't have to tell you guys this, you know it. A geostrategic advantage. So how do we respond to that? Back in the mid-20th century, America took the global lead in the atomic age, but unfortunately for our 21st century nuclear entrepreneurs and innovators, our regulatory framework is in many ways quite literally stuck in the 1950s. That's got to change. Mr. Harrell, it's good to see you here again. I plan on reintroducing my Strengthening American Nuclear Competitiveness Act this year, and a key aspect of my legislation is requiring DOE to provide a report on U.S. civilian nuclear commerce. With China and Russia currently dominating the international market, we've got to make sure we have a robust supply chain. So, Mr. Harrell, why is it so important to understand the gaps in our supply chain, particularly as it relates to nuclear?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for the question, and it's good to see you as well. You get at the very crux of this issue, right? This is not a zero-sum game. If the U.S. doesn't meet the demand that Europe, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia have, it doesn't mean that they're not going to build nuclear. It just means they're going to build it with someone else, most likely Russia or China. And so it's a national security imperative for us to compete on that front. And so your focus on technology exports and ensuring that we invest in our supply chain here to ensure project delivery is really a critical piece of global energy security as a whole.
Okay, thanks. Another provision in my legislation directs the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to look at unique industrial and manufacturing uses, as well as innovative advanced reactors that can be safely located closer to cities and businesses. So, Dr. Gehin and Mr. Harrell, you can chime in too if you'd like. If we can get this right, what would this mean for U.S. nuclear leadership?
Yeah, great question. It was talked about, mostly the discussion day has been about electricity, where 28% of our, talking about carbon from 28%. What about the other 62%? Well, reactors, particularly advanced reactors, produce a lot of energy, but they produce that at higher temperatures that can be directly used for industrial processes, whether it's hydrogen, steel, chemicals. X-Energy is working with Dow Chemical, oil refining, to reduce the carbon for that. So it really opens the door to address all these other areas that we need a lot of energy. And those can be deployed worldwide. We can establish them here. They can be deployed worldwide.
Okay, Mr. Harrell, any comments?
Yeah, I would completely agree there. There are immense opportunities here. Chemical production, steel production, hydrogen production, especially if we're going to use that for a variety of different applications. But that's going to force the regulator here in the United States in particular to think about these things differently. We need to be able to put a microreactor right pretty close to that Dow chemical facility to use both the heat and electricity for that process. If we have the same emergency preparedness zone of the plant like Davis-Besse in Ohio, you've got a mile security zone around that. That doesn't quite make sense in Louisiana and chemical country. One final
Point and question. I want to address fuel. It's a chicken or egg problem. You need the fuel, you need the new reactors as a market for the fuel, but you need a reliable fuel supply in order to build a reactor. the future of advanced reactors depends on HALEU. That's already been mentioned. Mr. Harrell, why is having a domestic supply of HALEU so important, and what happens if we do not have a sufficient supply of it for our nuclear innovators?
The Russians are the only entity that are capable of large supplies of HALEU. We don't want to be relying on Russia, so we absolutely need our own domestic supply. It's why the administration moving on this fuel program is critically important.
Basically, it comes down to whether or not we're going to lead or we're going to cede leadership to Russia and China, right?
100%, sir.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Great questions. I'll now go to Florida. Ms. Castor, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I was privileged to lead the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis for 4 years as we took a fresh look at electricity generation from nuclear power and the role it can play in fighting climate change. And we also issued a broad request for information. A lot of your folks responded to us, and you all provided very important input. So we developed very specific recommendations for ambitious reductions in carbon pollution through a cleaner, more resilient electricity sector. And then we successfully passed these important new laws, boosting carbon-free nuclear power. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, the $6 billion for the Civil Nuclear Credit Initiative to keep the existing nuclear power plants online and save thousands of jobs. In the CHIPS and Science Act, we authorized the historic research, development, demonstration, and deployment, including on both nuclear fusion and fission technologies. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act that you all have highlighted today for the generational investments in clean energy production, the production tax credit, clean energy production tax credit, the investment tax credits for new nuclear power plants that go into service after 2025. We're here to work with you to make that happen. But I'd like to go back to how we extend licenses and the safety considerations. Mr. Gehin, you said we have 92 reactors today, going to 94. As you look out across all of the reactors, what do you want us to know going in as we've invested money to safely look at extending these licenses, but what should we be anticipating? What should we know?
Yeah, so let me comment on it. Maybe Mr. Repko might want
Yeah.
to comment as well. So many of the reactors, in fact, I think most of the reactors currently operating will go from 40 to 60 years. They go through a regulatory process that's very rigorous on safety of those reactors, ensure they can operate safely. As Mr. Repko mentioned, those reactors are maintained impeccably. New components, new parts, looked at rigorously. There's been a few plants, including, I believe, Turkey Point, going to 80 years. It goes through a same rigorous process from a safety point of view to get to those 80 years. I think the biggest threat, at least in the past several years for these reactors, has been less to do with the technology and more to do with the economics as they've been competing with, low-price natural gas as well as incentivized renewable energy. So the Inflation Reduction Act and other activities have helped that. So I think the vision here would be all of our existing plants operating 80 years as we bring on new reactors, whether SMRs, advanced reactors, to get to perhaps this 300 gigawatt goal that I mentioned from this DOE report.
Mr. Repko, do you want to add?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As I said, we've already committed to the relicensing of our entire existing fleet, all 11 reactors. We've submitted that for the Oconee Station and making plans for the Robinson Station next. In terms of our resource planning, these assets are proven valuable and necessary in terms of meeting our carbon goals, and they have the regulatory support for that. And a lot of that is contributed not just for the clean, reliable power that they serve. Our entire fleet has served 24 consecutive years at capacity factors greater than 90%. 24 years consecutive. So, impressive reliability, impeccable safety. And then in terms of the community support.
Can I move on, because I just have one more minute?
Sure, I'm
here.
sorry.
I was so happy to hear you say that our customers will see lower electric bills thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act.
They will.
That is music to my ears, because Florida families are really being squeezed right now with high electric bills. And a lot of the reason for that
is Florida. You would think the Sunshine State, we would be a leader in solar power, but we generate electricity 75% based on gas. So they put all the eggs in in one basket. So you have these price spikes like we had at the pump, and then our electricity bills go out of sight. So I really hope that Duke Energy, in addition to what you're going to do across your service areas in all states, you know, expanding, making sure carbon-free nuclear power is there, that you're also just as enthusiastic about using these tax credits for solar power and wind power where it makes sense. But in Florida, we have such great potential for solar power to lower electric bills and to power our communities. I trust that you're just as enthused about that.
Absolutely. 800 megawatts of solar in Florida, planning on 300 megawatts a year in our future plans, all the incentives going back to the customers.
Thank you very much.
Joan Lady's time's expired. Now go to Mr. Bouchon from Indiana.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan. When it comes to the energy policy of the United States, Congress must act and all the above energy strategy, in my view, in order to maintain grid reliability, lower emissions, and ensure affordable energy prices using all sources of available energy is crucial. There is no doubt that nuclear energy plays an important part, if not critical part, of this diverse energy mix. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it here today. Chairman Duncan and maybe Chairwoman McMorris-Rodgers might have discussed, we were recently in Europe, in Poland, Czech Republic, and in Belgium. And what we heard on the nuclear side in Poland is dramatic. A lot of opportunity. In fact, American companies right now, American companies are competing for that business as Poland has completely taken themselves off of Russian natural gas and oil, for that matter. So there's a lot of opportunity for us here in the U.S. if we do this, not only to deploy nuclear power sources in the United States, but around the world, in our allies, and also in high emissions countries like India, for example. I mean, how are we going to get the worldwide emissions down if we don't have the opportunity to help deploy nuclear around the world? And so this is really important. And somebody may have touched on this earlier, but 4 years ago in the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act, which came out of this committee, Congress was directed the NRC to establish a risk-informed technology-neutral framework suitable for licensing advanced nuclear. Does anyone, Mr. Harrell, can you tell us, has NRC met those objectives under Congress's direction?
Thank you for the question, sir. The answer is no. The initial draft of the Part 53 rule does not meet those objectives, and effectively the NRC needs to go back to the drawing board. And to his credit, Chairman Hansen said at the RIC conference a couple weeks ago that they are going to send it back and they need to keep moving, because the key is going to be to get this right. All these designs that are about to move forward in this kind of 2025 to 2027 time period are going to use Part 50 and Part 52. It's an imperfect process, but they've got a strategy to go through the process and get their first reactors built. We need Part 53 for the future, the scale-up of these technologies, and what the commission put forth publicly a couple weeks ago simply doesn't meet that goal.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that? Mr. Cohen?
Yeah, we agree with that position. The current draft just doesn't do it. It just piles more complexity on the existing system. There, as I said earlier in the hearing, there's a way to do this in which less is more, and it's other countries have demonstrated the ability to do that.
Anybody else want to?
That I might offer for this committee is that NEI and the United States Nuclear Industry Council did a survey of 21, or a survey of proponents who might use the new rulemaking, and 18 of 21 responded back they would not use the rule in its current draft. So that alone tells you there's opportunity.
Yeah, sounds like we have a consensus for the most part here. And Mr. Johnson touched on this, using nuclear for other things other than electricity, right? And specifically hydrogen power, for example, has a lot of potential in the near zero greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly a source of growth in both the stationary and transportation energy sectors. Mr. Harrell, can you discuss some of the barriers to building reactors that can produce other end products, like directly using process heat or hydrogen?
Yeah, we need to take on a few key issues there. For example, how do we site a microreactor close to a chemical facility or to a steel production facility? How do we put those resources next to critical infrastructure to distribute hydrogen, for example? The existing regulatory framework really isn't conducive to that. To the NRC's credit, that is one area post-NEMA that they are starting to advance. They've done a proposed rule on emergency preparedness zones. They've done a proposed rule on a generic environmental impact statement, but they haven't voted it and moved it forward. And so it would be great to see the commission advance those things forward, because it's looking at these issues differently.
Great, I appreciate that. And I just want to say, I think the comments were made that if you have a lot more renewables, like solar, for example, that the cost of energy would be lower. And the actual fact is the data shows that the energy costs would be slightly higher in the short run with that situation. So I support an all-above energy approach, but I think the record needs to show that the data is inconclusive about if you go all the way to renewables, that you're going to have lower cost energy. That's just not true. And the other thing is then you have some potential for grid unreliability and instability. So as some people have mentioned, but that's why I think this nuclear discussion is really critical going forward. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now go to Maryland and Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for collaborating on this hearing today. And I haven't been here as long as some, and therefore not as focused on this issue as long as some have been. But I've been in a kind of listening and learning mode the entire time I've been here, which is a little over 16 years now. And certainly appreciate the important role in our energy portfolio that nuclear power can play. There's all kinds of concerns about it. You know what those are. Some of those are squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee. Others are not. But we recognize that this is an important part of the conversation. So I want to thank the members of the panel for being here today. Dr. Gehin, I'm interested in these advanced nuclear reactors because whatever little understanding I have of their potential encourages me to think that they may solve for some of the challenges that we've seen with kind of the larger, more traditional fleet of reactors, both in terms of what it means for siting, for waste, for cost, et cetera. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what that potential is, maybe point to current examples of where it's begun to be deployed, and can one argue that it could change the landscape on this or not?
Sure, good. Thank you for the question. You know, one of the features that you mentioned on the advanced reactors, they tend to be smaller. You know, we're completing these large light water reactors at Vogtle. These are massive construction projects. As we can shift for the advanced reactors from construction to manufacturing, he's already mentioned a little bit about making more of these in the factory where it's more cost effective to do so, where you can use all of our improvements in manufacturing technology to produce a large number of smaller reactors versus a few large reactors. There will be benefits. It also puts less capital at risk if you're an investor, that you're not investing in one giant thing, you're investing in a few smaller things, and you can deploy them as you're generating revenue from them. In terms of the technology itself, higher temperatures gives other applications that may generate more, higher revenue. Higher efficiency reactors get more energy out of your reactor because this is a higher temperature. You can transfer heat better and produce more efficient electricity as well. And then, the designs tend to have one of the key safety features is they tend to be passively safe. So you have fewer systems in these reactors, which will lower their costs. Admittedly, the first ones will probably be more expensive, but you need to go down that learning curve. So one of the objectives there is to build several of these, get an order book, get committed to building, build more of them.
Right. Could you hazard a guess as to, could you quantify what you think the ultimate allocation of the nuclear part of our portfolio might be between the traditional larger reactors and these advanced? I mean, could Could we live in a world one day where it's all advanced nuclear reactors, or no?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we continue to operate our current fleet for a long time, so we
Yeah,
keep our
okay.
existing large reactors. There is interest internationally in large reactors. Poland's a great example, as they really need to do major deployments. I think in the U.S., we'll be deploying small modular reactors, maybe as we get in, so you can scale those. Those
Yeah.
can be larger reactors just by scaling the number of modules as we build those out. That seems to be where most of the interest in, and maybe Mr. Repko can talk about Duke specifically, and the type of reactors. The large reactors, if you can build them on schedule, they operate very well, generate a lot of power, very cost effective, but right now we're in a situation where it's challenging for us to build those things.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about whether the sort of time that's passed in terms of making any more progress on the legacy kinds of reactors has brought us technologically to a place where this new opportunity is more available to us. Mr. Cohen, can you talk about the climate impact dimension of advanced reactors versus?
It's a pretty straightforward connection in my mind, which is that if we can deploy these things faster and cheaper, we're just going to have a bigger climate impact more quickly. There's nothing, I mean, it's zero carbon kilowatt hours.
Either way.
Yeah, that's the major issue.
Yeah, okay. All right, I think I've run out of time. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Appreciate it.
I thank the gentleman. Now go to Michigan. Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Last week, I had the pleasure of touring the Cook nuclear facility at the west edge of my district on Lake Michigan. I also have the Fermi 2 facility on the other side of my district on Lake Erie. And sadly, we're losing the Palisades nuclear facility just north of my district on Lake Michigan. The 2 plants that are still operating certainly are producing enough clean, reliable energy to power millions of homes, and they do. At both plants that I've toured, both Fermi and Cook, I've seen the incredible safety measures, the redundancies, the planning, and the experienced workforce that makes those things operate, including having what Cook calls the Fukushima building, where they have all the preparations made to handle anything that would come on, and not expecting it, but prepared nonetheless. Instead of being spooked by problems of the past and doing away with the nuclear power like our friends in the EU, U.S. companies invested time, money, energy, expertise to make this essential baseload power source even safer and more effective, and we've seen that. The energy crisis you see in Europe right now proves which decision was right. I'm excited about the future of nuclear energy with the challenges as well that are there, but I think we're also missing an opportunity to preserve and expand our existing fleet that we have in place, and so I'm glad this panel is here today. Mr. Gehin and Mr. Repko, you both discussed how to support our existing nuclear fleet. Some plants have looked into uprating and increasing power generation, something we significantly need as more and more coal and gas plants are forced, and I say that clearly, forced to shut down. What are the challenges to uprating existing facilities?
I'll go first. I will say, so thank you for the question, Congressman. So actually, half of our fleet has already been uprated. We've gone through that process already, and we are currently evaluating the opportunities for the remaining fleet. We think collectively we can gain another over 300 megawatts, again, of clean, reliable energy. So the process is established relative to doing that. It comes out through the economics, and as we see it, it's viable and supported by our regulators as well.
Mr. Gehin, what are the challenges?
I can add to that. You know, as you uprate the power, you need to look at, you know, the safety parameters, the evaluation of those things. Mr. Repko talked about that. That process has been established. You've uprated the plants. Occasionally, some plants need upgraded equipment. None of those I would consider are challenges. The challenge is whether the economics make sense. Fortunately, upgraded plants probably offer some of the cheapest additional generation that you can get because you've already invested in the plant. You're getting more out of the existing plant. So it's making the economics work. Production tax credits could be a benefit there as well as driving those decisions. The technical aspects are similar to what's done in operating the plants already and making the safety case.
Well, let me move on, Mr. Gehin. Flowing from that, what should Congress look at to ensure timely licensing decisions from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? Because that's part of the big cost, isn't it?
It is. It definitely is part of the cost. And so some of the things I outlined in my testimony are looking at some of the processes of the NRC regarding timelines for mandatory hearings. If there are environmental reviews, those can be time-consuming. And there's been a number of discussions broadly on trying to streamline environmental reviews for energy deployment. Some of the processes internally in setting time, specifically setting timelines at the NRC and trying to enforce those to try to move things along efficiently and effectively and to meet the expectations of being able to deploy these improvements when needed, rather than there being delays in those processes. So some of these aspects of how the NRC does business could be looked at, and there could be improvement there.
My final 25 seconds, any of you can answer this if you'd like to hop in. Fermi has a license that they spent a lot of time, money, and effort to get, but they don't think they probably will ever use it. Is there a scenario where building one becomes financially viable at a site like Fermi?
So are you asking in terms of new nuclear or extending Fermi?
This is new. This is a third license, and it appears that my time has expired, so I'll have to yield back.
We certainly see it for our fleet, so I think there could be lessons learned.
Okay, thank you.
And we're hoping those licenses get renewed, I can tell you that, because one of them is Oconee Nuclear Station. I'll go to California, Mr. Cardenas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the book. I commend this committee for convening this discussion, which should be happening far more often than it does, but at least we're here today. I'm hopeful this is something we can continue to make progress on in a bipartisan manner going forward. Nuclear currently accounts for nearly half of the zero-carbon electricity generated in the United States, and if done safely, could play a role in our efforts to address climate crisis that we're in today. However, I have serious concerns about the effects nuclear waste has on the health and safety of the communities living in proximity within it. Inequities and exposure to pollution are already persistent across our great country, and as we consider nuclear, we need to consider and address the legacy of toxic waste associated with this source of energy so as not to recreate, reinforce, or worsen environmental injustices upon communities in our country. Mr. Repko, of the nuclear plants that operate in the United States, how has low-level and high-level waste been dealt with and managed, and how has the safety, health, and security of nearby communities been impacted?
Yeah, Mr. Jim might be better.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, currently, when you look at the used nuclear fuel, it's stored in the spent fuel pool, moved to dry storage, which I think is the preferred longer-term storage until we work on this consolidated interim storage. I think to your point, trying to move to a central location. Those storage containers are incredibly robust. I don't know if you happen to visit a nuclear plant and see them, but that's pretty well established. The low-level waste, I think there are standard commercial processes that handle that. I'm not as familiar in that aspect of an operation of a plant, but those are usually processed out pretty quickly the way I understand it and moved to low-level waste disposal facilities. And so the material that stays at the site and in many of these sites after operation tends to be the used fuel that we're looking at this consolidated storage for.
So if you can continue on high-level waste, how long would that waste need to be in that, quote, dry-level storage? How many years?
Yeah, I mean, it'll need to stay in that high-level waste storage until there's a geologic repository developed, and this is, discussion today.
So today, how long have those How long have they been in storage of the facilities that have been active in the United States to this day?
Yeah, so since we don't have a geologic repository, we've been storing that since the original fuel is being stored in those. For some plants that are 40 years old, maybe Mr. Repko can comment, but for 40 years, these canisters have been designed, I think, for in excess of 100 years, maybe even longer than that. And so they're designed for very long-term storage, even though that's not the ultimate solution.
Got it. Yes.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, the casts are very robust. They have very extensive design basis relative to transportation accidents, vehicle, rail, fire, all those kind of aspects. But to the point made, all of the original fuel is still maintained. We have even had to go so far as to ship used fuel to our other nuclear locations to maintain room in our spent fuel pools for some of our sites. So it's a problem that needs to be.
Yes, so my point is this, looking at nuclear facilities as a whole, 360 degrees as a whole, yes, it's a cleaner fuel on the front end, but at the same time, there's a byproduct that we still need to solve long-term to make sure that the safety and efficacy of the facility and also the people potentially being affected long-term is actually solved. So we're still working on solving those issues, right?
I completely agree. Those issues need to be addressed. I will say there are radiological controls relative to this high-level waste. The design of the cask is built to attenuate those kind of aspects of it as well. I think there's a perspective, perhaps a valuable perspective. If you take all of the high-level nuclear waste that's been generated for operating reactors in the U.S., this is back to the 50s. It would be a volume of roughly a football field 30 feet high. That is the total volume of nuclear high-level used fuel waste that we're looking at. So in terms of solving this problem, it should give a perspective that's quite solvable.
It is quite solvable, but you actually put it into perspective of how much volume there is so far. But if we're going to have nuclear facilities going forward, we're going to have more than that one football field size. But so my point is, I think that we need to have longer discussions about how will we make sure that long-term, 360 degrees, how we can actually make sure that this is not only a cleaner fuel, but also a safer fuel. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now I'll go to Alabama to Ms. Palmer, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman. I want to get a little deeper into the whole issue of the nuclear fuel issue and the safety of, particularly the next generation nuclear. I've been looking at what France has done, and they have very tight legislation and a very strong regulatory body, which I think you have to have. But I think the real key to the safety and efficiency of the French nuclear fleet is the standardization of their design. It's almost cookie cutter. And the interesting thing about this, and this is what I'd like to talk to my colleagues across the aisle about, is French recycles what we've always considered spent fuel rods. I think that they're able to recover up to 96% of reusable material, and what's left, I think, can be used for other purposes. So it largely solves our issue of spent fuel, and I'd like for your comment on this, Mr. Harrell.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. There's an opportunity in spent fuel management, right? We can use the spent fuel repositories for productive use. You underscore a really key point. 95% of the energy in that spent fuel is being wasted. It's just sitting on site. And so advanced reactors, one could burn some of that resources as their fuel, and recycling is a huge opportunity. We see it abroad. We should invest in that. There are a lot of exciting companies that are USNIC members who are working in that space, like Oklo and Creo, for example. And so it's something we should explore moving forward. ARPA-E has recently done a program to explore recycling as well. I really think it is an opportunity. I wish Mr. Cardenas had stuck around, because new nuclear could actually reduce our spent fuel repository.
I promise you that when they're back in here, I'll remind them of it repeatedly. Mr. Gehin, I just wonder, with the amount of spent nuclear fuel that we have right now that we're trying to deal with, how many, I know this is a crazy question, but how many units do you think that would fuel, and for how long if we wanted to use all of that, because it doesn't take a lot.
Yeah, thank you for the, very good question. I actually did that calculation. If you just look at the spent fuel, which is not all the material we'll have, I'll comment on that in a minute, use that in a particular type of reactor such as we're developing, you could provide all the electricity for the U.S. for well over 100 years. That's a lot of power.
Just using up what we have.
That's
in
using
storage.
the used fuel. Now, in making that rich uranium, we also have depleted uranium that we produce, and there's a lot of that as well. That could also be fuel if we choose to use it. So in terms of fuel supply, if we choose to go that direction, we do the research and develop that technology, there's a lot of fuel available. Now, that's a longer-term endeavor to get to that point, but
Yeah, but it largely takes care of the issue of what we're having to do in terms of storage and
well,
spending billions of
you would-
dollars.
You would
paying
still
people
have disposal of radioactive waste or fission products
Right.
and other things. So you still would need disposal, but the scale would be lower.
Right.
You're right.
And Mr. Cohen, I really appreciate your answers to the questions, and particularly in regard to renewables. I'm one of these, I'm all of the above, but I also understand the variability issue, but I also understand the physics, and you touched on the physics a little bit. And we're not going to have an order of magnitude leap forward in terms of power generation from renewables, because we're pretty close to their maximum efficiency. But when you compare it to next generation nuclear, as I understand it, there are a couple of advantages that next gen nuclear would have over renewables. One would be the physical land use. I think you could put one nuclear facility on 640 acres, 1 square mile, and it'd take about, to generate the same amount of power from a turbine farm, it'd take about 77,000 acres. But the other thing that I want to address, and you other guys can answer this, I've only got a few seconds left, is that a next-gen nuclear facility would probably, it would operate 24/7, except when it's shut down for maintenance, and it would operate for 80 years plus, which Lord knows what the technology will be by then, whereas the turbine, the average turbine, I think, starts losing generating capacity after 10 years, and it's pretty much done after 25 to 30, and right now we're not able to recycle the blades. I'd just like for you guys, all four of you in the little bit of time left, to respond to that.
In my testimony, there is a comparison, and it doesn't even take into account the longevity of nuclear. It just says head-to-head. Nuclear is, in terms of material consumption, cement, steel, all the critical minerals, many orders of magnitude smaller. Then it's very compact, and that's one of the great advantages. So resource efficiency, hands down.
Mr. Chairman, I think this has been a very constructive hearing. I'm very grateful that we've held it. And I appreciate the comments from my colleagues across the aisle. I think we're at a place where we can have agreement and work together and get some things done. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the state of Washington, Ms. Schreier, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just thank all of the witnesses today and say how refreshing it is to have such a bipartisan committee hearing where everybody in this room is looking at how we can employ nuclear in a safe way to give us the base load that we need to power our communities. I also want to say that it was really pretty exciting to hear my Republican colleague talk about recycling. So I'm eager to get started. Let me first say also that I am very supportive of integrating nuclear energy into our energy portfolio. That includes bringing advanced nuclear to Washington State. Washington only has one nuclear plant right now, the Columbia Generating Station. It produces about 12% of our state's electricity with only a 1.7 square mile footprint. Which meets, in addition to hydropower, our baseload needs and avoids a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So by expanding our nuclear portfolio, in addition to the hydropower we have, but in many states that don't have that, this is baseload, we can really better integrate other renewables and wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. According to the Pacific Northwest National Lab, benefits of small modular reactors and other advanced reactors are expected to help reduce economic, security, technical, perceived safety, and regulatory barriers associated with nuclear power, which could then help establish new nuclear power throughout the country. Mr. Harrell, I'm going to direct this first question to you. You know, whenever we talk about a change in energy portfolio, there's anxiety about what will happen to people working in a different part of that industry at any given time, for example, coal that's on the decline. But according to the 2023 Department of Energy Pathways to Commercial Liftoff Advanced Nuclear report, advanced small modular reactors can create about 230 permanent on-site jobs per gigawatt. The report, and I'll need some translation of how that breaks down, what kind of jobs those are. But the report also found that the median nuclear industry wage is the highest in the energy industry. So coupled with the possibility of transitioning existing coal plant sites to advanced nuclear, this could be a boom in terms of employment opportunities. I was wondering how we can work with industry and labor to improve nuclear workforce development, where those jobs are, and how we can expand.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Congresswoman. And a lot of exciting things happening in Washington State in the advanced nuclear space. And so you're exactly right. The U.S. supply chain already employs 500,000 Americans. They're good, high-paying jobs. And I think we see in advanced nuclear some major opportunities. I just give you the example, the TerraPower Natrium project. They're headquartered there in Bellevue, Washington, but building their first project in Wyoming. It's going to create 2,000 construction jobs and then support 250 full-time employees. And a lot of those employees are going to transition from the coal plant that had retired there. I was talking a little bit earlier. They're separating the nuclear island versus the power plant functions. That way, there's a kind of a direct translation between the people who are working at the coal plant who could then work in that power plant function with pretty minimal training. I think assets like the national labs and some of the universities who are making a big push here. We're seeing universities like Abilene Christian, for example, is a U.S. NEC member that are building a research reactor on their campus and then really ramping up their nuclear energy program. And so things like that, I think, are really forward-leaning policies, and some of the universities in Washington State have done the same.
Thank you. I think that provides a great degree of comfort when these anxieties about transitions come up. I just wanted to thank you, and in the remaining moments wanted to underscore this bipartisan support. I'm excited to work with my colleagues. I also look forward to engaging with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and in the Senate with the recent introduction of the Bipartisan Advance Act. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I'll go to Mr. Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Ranking Member. I just have to think that anybody that cares about affordable, reliable, clean energy has to be very excited about today's hearing. This is, I think, a big deal for us. And Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, please, my appreciation for pulling us together and having this productive conversation. And I'm so pleased that it's fair to have questions about nuclear. I think that's great that questions are coming out. I personally believe there's not a single one of these obstacles that the industry can't overcome and tackle. And I regret that it seems like we've taken almost a couple decades out of innovation of this for a number of reasons we won't go into today. But I have no doubt, had we had our head in the game for a long time, all of these things would have been resolved. A couple of thoughts quickly. I'm from Utah. We have UAMPS. It's an organization, you're not in your heads, you're probably familiar with them. They've been engaged in trying to license a small nuclear reactor for a decade. They've spent about $100 million, and they're halfway through the process. Almost overwhelming, particularly if nuclear is really going to be part of our energy mix going forward. How can this be, right? This is clearly not acceptable if we're going to make nuclear a major part of what we're doing. I'm also fortunate PacifiCorp, Rocky Mountain Power in my district is working with Mr. Buffett on a very unique concept to put a nuclear plant on that would actually be positioned in Wyoming. Ironically, both of these would be in Wyoming. But Ms. Schreier, I'm really pleased that part of their process is to look at previous coal plants where they've closed down that are perfect homes for these small nuclear reactors. They have the transmission lines, and it is a really good answer. Most answers for these towns haven't really worked. This is an answer that I think would be very helpful and would work. And quite frankly, they would welcome this facility into their neighborhood. a couple of questions, like how do we help these early adopters, these early movers, right? How do we encourage this? I actually had a bill that would authorize the Secretary of Energy to make targeted awards to cover the regulatory cost of first technologies. Jeremy, you're nodding your head. Do you want to weigh in on this? How do we start this thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congressman. It's great to see you. I mean, you underscore this kind of crazy scenario, right? NuScale itself, beyond UANTS, had to spend $500 million in 5 years to get their design certification. Then the customer, UAMPS, is then spending another insane amount of resources. That's not feasible for a municipal co-op or organization along the lines, or anyone, frankly, right? And so that is why it's important to have prizes, for example, to help early movers go through the process. The entire industry is benefiting from what NuScale did to go through the process first. They should have get support, and they did from the federal government going through it. It's why tax incentives and having those be refundable, so municipals or co-ops can use it to deploy their first project. And programs like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, because as we mentioned, folks want to be project 2, 3, or 4, but we need those pioneers, the folks like UAMPS, to be successful so that we unlock the scale up of these technologies.
Yeah, big shout out to them, right, for trying. And I wish I had time to hear from all of you. Let me kind of switch gears just a little bit. Where does uranium come from to do this? My district has a uranium mill that is constantly under attack. We're dependent on our in China, right, for this, and other places outside the United States. How do we change that dynamic to where we're not dependent for uranium? Anybody want to? And I need a short answer. Mr. Gehin,
yeah, I'll
please.
talk a little bit about that. One of the things that was talked about a little bit earlier about there being enough demand to make this economically feasible to mine uranium. Uranium has been very cheap for a while, internationally selling at low prices. So we need this demand signal for this.
I'm so out of time, so let me just push it along a little bit. Like processing too, right? We've got to talk about not just mining.
It's the whole supply chain,
Processing.
mining, processing, conversion.
Yeah. Now, also, this Pacific Core project is going to produce hydrogen. Jeremy, will you talk real quick about how important it is to not forget hydrogen as part of this, and are we offering the right incentives for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's why permitting reform is really important. We're going to need to be able to build out hydrogen distribution infrastructure because the production that's going to be happening at exciting sites like nuclear facilities.
I'm out of time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for having this hearing. I would just end with, I have heard, and nod your head if you think it's true, that nuclear is actually one of our safest forms of energy, all things said. The big incidences we all hear about, right? But we forget how many lives have been lost in other forms of energy. So despite its reputation, this is actually very safe. And Mr. Chairman, I regrettably yield my time.
I thank the gentleman. Members' votes are going to be called at 5. We're going to continue and just work right through it. We'll swap the chair out here, but when votes are called, if you feel like going to vote, come straight back. It's one vote, so we're just going to move through. Chair will now go to Arizona, Ms. Lesko, who has the largest nuclear power facility in her district, and for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, just outside of my district is Palo Verde Nuclear Plant, so I'm very proud about that. We've talked a lot about needing new sources for uranium and nuclear fuel, especially if we're going to expand and have more modular nuclear reactors, and that we're too reliant on Russia for nuclear fuel and crucial isotopes. And so, Mr. Harrell, what are your thoughts on recycling nuclear waste?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. And Palo Verde was the very first nuclear facility I ever visited, so it really is a gem in the fleet. Recycling is a huge opportunity, right? We should absolutely be investing in research and development and exploring it as an option. It can both reduce our spent fuel reserves and increase our own fuel security by turning that spent fuel into product that we can use.
And what do you think the obstacles are to recycling waste?
Some of it is just political gumption. You know, I think that the DOE is not restricted on exploring that option. We heard, you know, Rita Barronwall, the Assistant Secretary of Nuclear Energy in the Trump administration, talk about it regularly. ARPA-E is doing some public-private partnerships with companies at the moment. I think we need to explore. There's absolutely non-proliferation concerns that need to be taken into account, but Japan has solved for those issues with the IAEA, as have the French and others. It's absolutely a manageable situation, and frankly, an opportunity that we're squandering at the moment.
And how about the cost? Is it too costly?
The fuel that would be produced from recycling would be more costly than for the lack of a better way of putting it, greenfield production. But what you do need to factor in is the cost liability of spent fuel that we have right now.
Right.
Someone earlier was talking about the millions of federal taxpayer dollars that have been used because we don't have a long-term repository. The offset of that cost to the federal government needs to be considered in the price as well.
All right. My next question is to any of the witnesses. Today I just met with electric cooperatives from Arizona, and they were very concerned about making sure they have reliable electricity on the grid. One of the electric co-ops said they were now down to one coal plant, and that they were having a really hard time getting batteries for energy storage for the solar. That they were waiting now for 2 years. They haven't been able to get it. The supply chains are terrible. Costs are going up. And we are spending in the United States billions of dollars on subsidies for solar and wind energy. And I was wondering what your thoughts are and if we should divert some of those subsidies to nuclear. That's my question. Mr. Cohen.
We're going to need it all. I mean, we'll be lucky if we have a lot of nuclear and a lot of solar and get to where we need to go. I don't think we can do this as a zero sum. It's certainly true that nuclear is not being rewarded in the marketplace for its characteristics. So you often get this false comparison, and people say, well, you know, solar is 3 or 4 cents and nuclear is 7 or 8. You know, well, that's just on a straight kilowatt hour basis. It doesn't account for reliability. So there's some things that can be fixed in state regulation to make that happen. I don't know that you'd call that a subsidy. I'd call that recognizing the value. And if we could sort that out, I think we'd get a long way towards, we certainly wouldn't be seeing plants shut down like they are right now. But I don't think there's a silver bullet here, honestly. I think the tripling the electric supply in the U.S., all zero carbon, is going to need everything we got and more.
Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe, I totally agree with that. I also think making sure nuclear is included as part of the option set. You know, in some places, I expect it's not yet because of the, you know, the concerns about risk actually completing projects. So as we see these advanced reactors development, that create more opportunities to include it in integrated resource plans and things like that.
All right. Thank you.
The last thing I'll add is I'm confident that new nuclear is going to compete in the commercial marketplace without these type of incentives eventually. I think they're critical for these first movers to do their first-of-a-kind deployment, but as we scale these, mass produce them, and deploy, I think we're going to see a very similar situation to what we saw with U.S. natural gas, that these are going to be really attractive in U.S. electricity markets and globally from a price, affordability, and security standpoint.
Well, great. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens at the Idaho National Laboratories on the modular reactor and see if we can replicate it and use it. It's exciting. And thank you all for being here for now 3 hours without leaving the table. I really appreciate all of your expertise, and I yield back.
Generally yields back, and I'll go to Mr. Pence from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member DeGette for holding this meeting, bipartisan meeting, and thank you to the witnesses being here today. And I echo my peers. I don't know how you sit there for that many hours. I could never do that. You know, in the Hoosier State, innovators are leading the way to power the next generation of nuclear energy. Purdue University is a national leader in nuclear engineering programs and home to the country's first and only fully digitized nuclear reactor used to train students and research cyber physical protection. Purdue has also undergone extensive collaboration with Duke Energy to to study opportunities to use next-generation small modular reactors to power their campus. Rolls-Royce in Indianapolis is advancing their reactor designs for a transportable small modular reactor designed to provide 470 megawatts of baseload power. While Indiana currently does not have nuclear assets powering our grid, the state legislature has begun paving the way for utilities to deploy advanced nuclear reactors across our state. We're looking forward to it. Mr. Repko, earlier this year, I had the opportunity to meet with DOE Assistant Secretary Dr. Huff and Duke Energy at Purdue University as you collaborate with the school on a joint feasibility study to bring nuclear power to their campus. The joint effort from Purdue and Duke made several important policy recommendations to accelerate commercial deployment of advanced reactor technologies. In particular, one recommendation focused on a university-led consortium of industry leaders and researchers for advanced nuclear convergent manufacturing, qualification of manufacturing components, and workforce development. In order to bridge the gap of commercialization for small modular reactors, research universities are well-positioned to utilize advanced technologies and expertise in material science to assist the deployment and operation of small modular reactors. Can you speak, sir, about the importance of your company's collaboration with Purdue University and the potential benefits for implementing a public-private consortium, including the universities, for convergent manufacturing and workforce development?
Yes, Congressman, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. So we have been working with Purdue, as you said, and we very much valued those interactions. Purdue is an engineering leader, and we very much appreciate their interest in small modular reactor technologies. So, I would offer that, the recommendation around the consortium is really, at the heart of what we've been talking about collectively here, right? All of the different aspects of risk, some of the technical challenges, the environmental considerations, the workforce and supply chain. It's going to take more than just a one singular type solution set around the granted, it's going to be necessary in terms of that market signal to get the rest moving, but that's only going to be the start. So I think that framework gives us the opportunity to look broader around all of the aspects that will enable small modular reactors for Purdue University and beyond.
Yeah, I think as Mr. Harrell said, being able to deliver projects on time, you need the workforce, educated workforce in this space, and I know that Purdue is dedicated to that. Dr. Gehin, in your testimony, you mentioned Project Pele, an innovative microreactor initiative that holds tremendous potential to advance military and civil capabilities. Rolls-Royce, who has facilities in Indianapolis, has partnered with the DoD for microreactor development through Project Pele. Can you take a moment to speak to the importance of this project and the steps you're taking to bring this innovation to the commercial market?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, Project Pele is Department of Defense project to develop a mobile microreactor. It's a pilot project. The reactor is being designed and developed by BWXT with Rolls-Royce and other partners, as you mentioned. It will be tested at Idaho National Laboratory. We have a large site able to do tests, so the plans are to test it there. The fuel that's used for that was technology developed through DOE R&D programs, TRISO fuel as well. So the research is being led to technologies that will go into that reactor. And then, as that reactor is developed and tested, it'll be authorized by the Department of Energy. So this, with all the discussion on regulation, it's taken a little different path.
And that's
it's very appropriate
timeline
to do that, so we can
innovation.
move on a quick timeline, get that demonstrated with the goal of this is the first. We talked about first mover. This should lead to further developments in this space.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pence. Now go to Mr. Weber from Texas.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. For those of you who don't know, when I was in the Texas legislature, I had South Texas Nuclear Project in my district. And it's about probably 35 so miles from my district now, from the county line. We were there in 2010 and watched them change out spent fuel rods with their own eyes. It's fascinating. They could do it cleanly. They could do it safely. I was encouraged to see that you were having discussion with the Congresswoman DeGette and Congressman Cardenas about nuclear waste. Are any of y'all aware of waste control specialists in West Texas and Andrews, Texas? Dr. Gehin is, and you are, Mr. Harrell, but the other two are not. Have either of y'all been there? I've been there. I was on the Environmental Reg Committee in the Texas legislature. It's a fascinating facility. It's so huge and so big and so intense on, of course, I get that that's low level. So we ought to be focused on their concerns that they legitimately raised. What do we do with some of that waste? First of all, reprocessing and using as much of it as we could is what I think the best alternative. Mr. Cohen, I'm going to go to you. Can you talk more about how nuclear waste recycling can be a solution to the problem of storing waste and a way to produce valuable fuel and isotopes?
I don't consider myself an expert on that, Congressman Weber. To be fair, I'd like to get back.
You know, an expert's just someone who's 50 miles from home.
Okay, fair enough. You know, I think clearly there's the opportunity to harvest the remaining energy value in the fuel for sure. I do think that it's sometimes, we had earlier back and forth about whether you're really reducing a lot of the volume, and that's debatable. You can certainly reduce the total amount, but you know, whether it's an order of magnitude or not is another question. I really think I ought to defer to the scientists on the platform regarding the harvesting of the other.
Is it Gehin? How do you say your last name?
Gehin.
Mr. Gehin, to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and so we've been doing research on recycle for a long time. In fact, we are recycling fuel at Idaho National Laboratory from the EBR-2 reactor to produce HALEU, so there's a real value to that. So we have a lot of expertise. You know, the questions, I think the questions that have been around this has been right. Is it economic to do so? It hasn't been because uranium has been very inexpensive. And then, you know, can you factor in the benefits, you know, as addressing the back end? So the studies that we've done, if you do full continuous recycle, which you keep recycling through the reactors, you potentially get to an order of magnitude less spent fuel and high-level waste because you're burning things and turning it into shorter-lived things. That's a long-term endeavor. You can do limited intermediate recycle. There's some benefits to that. So there's a range of options. I think the real need is to do research to improve the economics, as well as research on ensuring we can deploy it confidently in terms of proliferation risk if we deploy this broadly. So those are the types of areas that need to be looked at.
So you said you had been to, or you were aware of waste control specialists out in Andrews County. Have you been there?
I haven't been there, unfortunately. I'd love to visit there.
You have not been there. Well, just for the benefit of our friends across the island and our team here too, South Texas Nuclear Project, they took us out and showed videos of how they store. Some of y'all were talking about waste in a canister. I forget. Was it you, Dr. Gehin?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's moved from the spent fuel dried, put in canisters, and what you'll see is a concrete pad with these cylinders on it.
Right. Well, back then in 2010, what we saw was they would take that canister, they didn't put waste in it. This was testing of the canister to show how viable they were and how strong. They put it on a flatbed rail car, and they ran that rail car into a solid concrete wall, and rail car just went to pieces, wheels came off of it, it rolled. The chains holding the canister broke. Canister goes out spinning, you know, on the ground, wherever it was. Canister stayed intact. We can store this stuff safely. Thoughts on the Yucca Mountain? I'll stay with you, Dr. Gehin, for my last 40 seconds.
Yeah, so obviously Yucca Mountain is a I'll call it a political issue. It's been investigated, extensively for spent fuel storage. It hasn't gone through the full regulatory process. There could be value in doing that, of course, to understand if it could be a viable place. But from the way I understand it, I'm a scientist. I think this is in political space.
So it's political science, but you don't want to get in that realm. I got it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Chairman, and I appreciate Chair Duncan holding this important hearing to discuss the critical needs, which we talked about, in expanding nuclear energy and really an all-out energy program for this country. We know that our energy needs are going to increase dramatically, And I think nuclear energy is going to play, and it will play, a big part of that because it's clean, affordable, safe, and we got to work towards solutions that expand the use of commercial energy, nuclear energy to be energy dominant as we were just a few years ago. In my district, we have Plant Vogtle, where units 3 and 4 are currently under construction. It's well known that these are the first nuclear reactors under construction in the United States in more than 30 years. Currently in operation are units 1 and 2, which power more than 500,000 homes and businesses. Unit 3 is expected to come online in the next few months. And Unit 4 is expected to come online towards the beginning of next year. Unit 3 actually hit a milestone in April as Unit 3 recently generated electricity on the grid and is connected to the grid. Once both Units 3 and 4 come online, Plant Vogtle will be the largest single generator of clean energy in the United States. This is a huge accomplishment for nuclear energy in America, and I'm proud that it is being done in my home district. I am hopeful we can use what we have learned in constructing Plant Vogtle to further expand our nuclear energy. I also want to shout out a big thanks to Southern Company and their perseverance through multiple challenges to finish the construction of these important facilities. Mr. Gehin, we have learned a lot about what it takes to build large-scale nuclear reactors from Plant Vogtle. Units 3 and 4 cost more than anticipated, and when seeing projects of this size and cost, companies may be weary. And we've talked about the investment risk in building large-scale nuclear reactors. So how can we use the lessons of Plant Vogtle to help build future facilities to better predict investment cost and capital risk?
Right. Thank you for the question, and congratulations on these plants. A lot of times you learn the most from things that maybe don't go well, and you take those lessons learned. So there's plenty here to take from this regarding construction planning, finalization to design, some probably input there on regulatory processes. So this will be a case study in those, and taking that to future nuclear plants. I also think, in addition to the Vogtle plants, there are other plants that are being built in the world and are being done well, and we can take lessons learned from them. One of the lessons learned is, you really want to build a pipeline of these reactors, so you take the lessons from Vogtle 3 and 4, carry those on to the next one. So it's kind of unfortunate we're not continuing to build more of these. The experience has been in United Arab Emirates, for example, where they built 4 units, that the labor productivity on units 3 and 4 was double that on unit 1 and 2, and so there was, sort of the cost of doing business that could have in Vogtle 3 and 4 that could have benefited the next units, and unfortunately, we're not going to be doing that. So we'll have to take that to other reactors that may be designed and built.
And I agree with that, because it's almost like over that 30 years, we had a few people around that had actually built reactors and could understand exactly the unique construction application there. Will any of these issues that we've seen as far as labor force and training and that sort of thing, and inefficiency in module fabrication that cause the challenges at Vogtle 3 be issues for the small modular reactor generation reactors, Mr. Gehin?
Yes, and so if we don't learn the lessons, they could be. Fortunately, we are learning the lessons. The other aspect is on the smaller reactors, as I mentioned earlier, we're shifting more to factory fabrication, which has also reduced those risks. Also, the fact that they're smaller puts less at risk at any one time, and so it's maybe more tolerable.
Well, I'm out of time. Thank you all for being here, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was quick. Thank you all for being here today and for your patience. My first question is for Dr. Gehin. In your testimony, you mentioned the schedules and fee structure should be reflective of the scale and complexity of the reactor designs. How could the fee structure be improved to encourage reactor demonstrations and investments?
Yeah, so some thoughts on that. First of all, and the question I got from the chairman related to the fraction of cost for a plant. Obviously, if you're building a large plant, that's different than if you're building, say, a 10 megawatt microreactor, and where you really need to minimize those fees and costs. It should be right-sized to the risk. It should be risk-informed, approach based on the size of the reactor. There are also cost and fees of just entering into the regulatory process through pre-application meetings, things like that, that could also be offset to lower a barrier to entering that regulatory process.
Thank you. Somewhat caught off guard here, so hold on. You're next. And Mr. Bashan asked part of my question on the 53 issue, but that's why I'm kind of jumping around here. But Mr. Harrell, thank you. There is a significant market for nuclear energy abroad, obviously, and we've talked about that all afternoon. We talked about the trip. I was part of the CODEL that we went with my colleague and friend, Mr. Pfluger. China, Russia, Poland, they all are in a pretty good place. We do know about the issue that just happened with Germany being shut down. How imperative is it that the United States continues to lead the way in developing these new innovative technologies?
It's an imperative, as I discussed a little bit. It's not a zero-sum game here. The countries who are interested in nuclear here, if the U.S. doesn't partner with them, it doesn't mean they're not going to pursue nuclear. It just means they're going to do it with China or Russia, most likely, or maybe other international competitors. But the U.S. really has a position to seize this opportunity. Some of our friends at Third Way and Energy for Growth Hub did an analysis that by 2050, the global nuclear market could be $360 billion annually. That's a market that we want to seize economically here, right? And we have cutting-edge designs. Our entrepreneurs are ready to come to the commercial market space. So let's get the economic benefits, let's get the energy security benefits, and ultimately forge these century-long partnerships with some of these allies rather than China and Russia.
Okay, thank you. I've spoken at previous hearings about the global environment benefits of exporting our clean natural gas, especially to these developing nations. Can you discuss the possible environmental benefits that nuclear energy exports could provide? It's an easy one for you.
Yeah, it's a great question. IEA's expectation is we need to double nuclear globally by 2050 to have any shot of meeting deep emissions reduction goals. So it's a huge opportunity, a huge economic opportunity for the U.S. And so we should be exporting clean U.S. natural gas, and we should be exporting these exciting zero-emission nuclear technologies.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's critical, as has been mentioned, that there was travel by this committee abroad, and really one of the things that came out of the trip, and we know this, but it was highlighted especially by the Polish government, the Prime Minister, the President of the Czech Republic, on just how important energy security is. Very happy to see Eastern Europe, that literally has been the victim of the weaponization of Putin and Putin's energy plays, moving towards a realistic view. I kind of want to get into some numbers here. Mr. Cohen, I think you mentioned some of the numbers with regards to the wattage that nuclear power can provide. Let's just look at estimates in the United States of the electricity demand that we're going to have. Concerned about the Biden administration's move to mandate some of the electric vehicles and not have enough electricity for this. So what can nuclear do in providing the supply that this country needs?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So in the testimony, we cite at least one study that suggests that between vehicle electrification, industrial electrification, and just underlying growth, we'll probably need to do something like double to triple kilowatt hours produced in America in the next 3 decades, just an absolute hyperleap. So then and if we're to meet climate goals, all of that's going to have to be zero carbon, and we're going to have to replace all the unabated fossils, like if you want to meet that objective. So you're really talking about a massive amount of stuff, and the question is, what can nuclear contribute to that? We do know that France was able to decarbonize its grid in 15 or 17 years with repeat builds, standardized designs. If we can get to that, I would guess that, you know, we could meet 30, 35%, 40% of that total build with nuclear, but we're gonna have to get busy.
Which is double or triple what we are currently seeing right now.
So we're probably, what that means is probably something like quadrupling.
So
our
is current nuclear power baseload capable?
It has proven to be.
The softball question, and I think of course we all know that it does provide reliable, affordable, and also security-wise is a great option. Mr. Harrell, I love your comments on, and Mr. Cohen, yours too, on how if we don't do this here, and this question was just posed, then it's going to be exported. Somebody else is going to do it. So both for security reasons, to remain competitive, and also for climate reasons, we have to export what we're doing here. And can you expand on, if we don't, just how vulnerable that makes us on a demand issue, but also on a security issue?
Yeah, I'll give you a perfect example. There's been increased partnership with Romania over the last couple years. We're going to build some small modular reactors in Romania. They directly canceled partnerships with China because they saw the direct impact of that type of relationship with China. China was going to control their reactor builds, have a significant influence over their grids. They thought the U.S. is a better partner that. It's a perfect model. It's why countries like Poland are really excited in cutting, one of the single largest clean energy deals in the history of this country to build 5-6 gigawatts of the beautiful AP1000 reactors that are being completed in Georgia right now. And so it's a huge opportunity for us as we drive forward, and we should use our technological prowess and those inherent advantages to kind of spread affordable, clean, reliable, secure energy across the globe.
I'm actually not an advocate for all of the above. I'm an advocate for the best of the above. And when you have the ability and the technology and it makes sense, then we should use it. One of the concerns I have is about storage. For either of you gentlemen, in West Texas, we have a tremendous amount of energy, all types of energy. There's an interim storage facility that has caused quite a commotion. I don't know that it's gone through procedurally, at least for our community, the right steps. I'm interested when it comes to storage and finding a permanent solution or a permanent facility, what your thoughts are. I know we have 25 seconds left.
Yeah, as I've talked about it, as far as interim, the approach that's being pursued is a consent-based approach to, put interim storage where it's welcome type of thing. Long term, again, I think you'd use a consent-based approach, but we're going to need a repository, a permanent repository at some point, regardless of what we do. So we'll have to get there.
I'll have to take yours for the record in a written form. I'm out of time, but thank you so much. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now I'll go to Georgia, to Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you letting me weigh on this committee. This is extremely important to me, and I have a high interest in it, and that's why I asked as a member of the full committee to waive on this subcommittee. And I'm like you, Mr. Chairman, I'm very excited about the future of nuclear. Very excited, and it's going to provide our country with reliable, clean, secure baseload power. And as you just mentioned, we in the state of Georgia are very proud of the fact that we have the first 2 nuclear reactors that are going to be going online, and one of them's already online and connected to the grid, producing electricity. So we're very, very excited about that. First time in decades that we've had one in this country. And, there have been 31 reactors that have commenced construction since the beginning of 2017, and 27 are either Russian or Chinese. And that's just, we have got to get past this, and we've got to, not only in this country, but we've got to convince our allies that this is the way to go. I'm convinced of it. And, and then we hear the exciting news that the NRC approved the first advanced SMR nuclear design and the breakthroughs in fusion. So exciting times in energy. And thank my colleague from Texas, because he's right. I want the best of the above. All of the above is important, but I want the best of the above, and I'm convinced that nuclear is part of that. Venture capitalists have been putting money into this. We know that as well, and that's very important, and we're encouraged to hear that. But we're missing the boat, and we've been missing the boat for quite a while now with
not investing in nuclear. And, you know, the nuclear reactor market's valued at $500 to $750 billion over the next 10 years. We need to be part of that here in the United States. That's why, along with my colleague, Representative Scott Peters, we've introduced legislation, the Global Nuclear Energy Assessment and Cooperation Act. This is a multi-pronged approach to what we're trying to do. First of all, it will prohibit us from importing the fuels from hostile foreign nations like Russia and China. That'll encourage energy independence and prevent our country from becoming reliant on other countries, on our enemies for our nuclear energy needs. Secondly, it'll introduce a program, the International Nuclear Reactor Export and Innovation Branch. It'll introduce that program at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to focus our international nuclear efforts, including training and sharing expertise with our allies. That's something I hope that you will agree, and I think you will, that we need to be doing. We don't have to do this by ourselves, but we need to encourage our allies to be in this with us. So I'll with this growing appetite for nuclear power around the world, and clearly we have much, we would much rather help provide that than Russia and China, who will only use it for leverage. Mr. Harrell, let me ask you, do we have a comprehensive idea of all the countries that want to pursue nuclear energy and would be happy to work with us to get to what it would take to make it happen?
Yeah, there's roughly 50 countries, a little more, that have expressed interest in either starting nuclear programs or growing their nuclear programs in the last couple years, and so it's an immense global market opportunity.
So how would having a strategy, such as I mentioned here, and I am self-serving, this is our legislation. It's bipartisan legislation, by the way. Representative Peters is on the other side of the aisle, but we both believe in it strongly. So what would having a strategy and a full picture of the potential nuclear market benefit the U.S.? How would it benefit us?
I think this license harmonization that you mentioned is a really key piece. Armond actually mentioned this a little bit as well. We need to be able to use the NRC standard and then ultimately have that translate over to building in Poland, into Romania, into Ghana, wherever it may be. And so this direct partnership among the regulators and literally opening up global markets. If there's an easy translation there, of course the country is going to be more excited about partnering with the U.S. because they can build off our expertise and then ladder it up. It's exactly what we're saying with Canada, U.S., and Poland with the Hitachi.
And that's what we need to do. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We need to be sharing our knowledge and sharing our expertise here, and we need to be gaining it as well. I'll go to the rest of the panel. I know that we're at the end, and I'm probably the last one. I'm not sure. But anyway, how does the U.S. nuclear energy, the U.S. nuclear industry standards compare to China and Russia's? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, maybe others can comment. I don't have deep knowledge of China and Russia. I know we have if you just look at the operations of our plant, Mr. Repko can talk about our plant's highest capacity factors. We get the most energy out of them. They're most economically run. Just based on what we know about ourselves, I think we're world leaders with the existing fleet.
The cheeky answer would be, how would we know? Right? But I'll just share one data point. We asked a experienced MIT nuclear engineer who had actually helped build some of the China plants to go back and see if they were being operated safely. And his conclusion was basically Western standards are being applied in the safety. He did an audit. You couldn't go much farther than that. They don't do much publicly. But
right.
He said, I don't lose a lot of sleep over that, for whatever that's worth.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, again, I'm excited, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me wave on this committee, and thank you all for being here.
I thank the gentleman. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for being here. Your testimony was phenomenal, and I think you saw the bipartisan nature. I wish more of the Democrats would have shown up and engaged in this, but they're going to have some opportunity because I've asked staff to put together a summary of the key takeaways so that we can start crafting legislative package, have a markup, and push some legislation through Congress to really expedite and propagate nuclear power in this country and get us back on track. So I want to thank you. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. And pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 legislative business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask witnesses to submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. And so that will conclude the American Nuclear Energy Expansion, Powering a Clean and Secure Future hearing, and without objection, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.